Welcome back. It was a crime which pushed everything else off the front pages. 3 men, all known criminals, found shot dead in the Essex countryside. It was a cold-blooded, professional killing. The victims had many enemies, but which one wanted them executed?
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex Boys case. As always, if you are enjoying the content, please do give the video a thumbs up. And if you're interested in the Essex Boys case or simply true crime in general, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. With hindsight, Craig Rolfe's descent into a life of crime seems almost inevitable. After all, his first view of the world was the grey walls of Holloway Prison. His mother, Lorraine, was serving 18 months after lying to police in a bid to protect her teenage lover. That lover had ruthlessly beaten her husband, Rolfe's dad, with a skittle until his skull was crushed like an eggshell. Tony Tucker was later to tell his gang members the sad story of Rolfe's birth, which had left him with a chip on his shoulder. Lorraine, then of Linford Drive, Basildon, had been seeing 19-year-old John Kennedy while her husband Brian worked as a market trader. On Christmas Eve 1968, the youngster crept into their home as the 28-year-old Brian lay asleep next to Lorraine. He killed him. When she was woken by the noise, Kennedy allegedly told her, "I have done it to prove how much I love you." Kennedy of Butneys, Basildon, and 23-year-old Lorraine were arrested and both charged with murder. Lorraine, who was already a mother of 3 and expecting Rolfe, told police, "I never touched him, honest on my baby's life." She was cleared of the murder charge, but sobbed as the judge sentenced Kennedy to life. Then, as he gave her 18 months for making false statements, Mr. Justice Bridge told her, quote, "I accept as the basis of my sentence that you were confronted with a dilemma when you realised your lover had murdered your husband. But I cannot escape from the conclusion that it was an event which caused satisfaction rather than distress, and you were prepared to do what lay in your power to see your lover escape punishment." Lorraine cried, "I'd done nothing." As she was led from the Sussex Assizes Court supported by prison officers, she later said, quote, "I was 3 months pregnant with Craig when his dad was murdered. My family has been dogged by bad luck." Rolfe, a cocaine addict, became a gopher for Tucker when he joined his gang in the early 90s. He was probably his most trusted friend, and associates say he was quite possessive of Tucker. He was certainly implicated in some of the gang leaders' most dubious scams. In September 1995, they were approached by a part-time drug dealer who had £18,000 of cannabis to sell. Tucker and Rolfe took the man to Birmingham, where Tucker claimed to have a contact. While the dealer and Rolfe waited, Tucker disappeared with the drugs. He returned, saying police had busted them before he got the money. The dealer either had to accept the excuse or take them on. There is no police record of a bust in the city at that time. Rolfe lived with his long-term girlfriend in the commuter belt of Chafford 100. He also owned a property in Mill Green, Basildon. Their daughter was only 7 at the time of the killings. The following article comes from the 21st of January 1998 with the headline, "Lured to their doom." For Peter Theobald and Kenneth Jiggins, it started as a routine early morning drive to feed pheasants in the snow in the Essex countryside. But as the pair turned their vehicle up Workhouse Lane, an isolated farm track just off the main Chelmsford to Southend Road, they got their first inkling that something was wrong. Blocking the padlocked gate at the end of the track was a metallic blue Range Rover that shouldn't have been there. Cursing, Mr. Jiggins braved the cold to get the vehicle shifted. As he walked up to the Range Rover, he could see there were people inside. But there was no response to his tapping. He began to think they were asleep, but then saw blood on the faces and realised they were dead. Things moved quickly after that. The emergency services descended on the scene in force, and within hours the names of the 3 dead men were known: Craig Rolfe, Pat Tate and Tony Tucker. All were from South Essex, all had been blasted with a shotgun at close range, and all were known criminals with connections with the drugs underworld. A massive manhunt was launched with no shortage of suspects. But true to the criminal code of silence, nobody was giving anything away. Except one man. Former small-time drug dealer and petty criminal Darren Nichols turned supergrass after police started to investigate his links with the triple killing. Getaway driver Nichols, who now has a new identity and a new life with police protection, led detectives to two men. Engineer Michael Steele, 55, and 36-year-old Jack Womes were questioned and later charged with the killing of the three men. Steele of St Mary's Road, Angers Green, Great Bentley, and Womes of Main Road, Brockford, Suffolk, both denied the charges. In court, they produced alibis and accused Nichols of fabricating the story to deflect attention away from his own involvement in the slayings. Security was tight with armed police surrounding Chelmsford Magistrates Court as the pair appeared in the dock for the first time. Then, on September the 2nd last year, the trial began at the Old Bailey and became one of the longest and most expensive criminal trials ever. During the months of questioning and cross-questioning, the patient and long-suffering jury of 8 women and 4 men listened as Supergrass Nichols relayed his version of events. The background to the assassinations was outlined to the court by Andrew Munday QC at the start of the trial. Tate had apparently threatened to kill Steele when he believed he was not properly compensated for substandard cannabis the court heard. But Steele and Womes decided they would eliminate the threat once and for all. They planned the triple killing to take place on a cold and snowy December night. Tate and his associates were lured to the scene on the promise of a new and substantial deal, this time in cocaine. As they relaxed in their Range Rover, 8 shots were fired rapidly into their heads from close range. But what prompted such terrible acts? The answer, it would appear, was a dispute over a consignment of very poor quality cannabis. Dealing in drugs is not an honourable trade. It is often the province of the double cross, the sting and the double deal. After the shootings, Steele said he felt a bit like the angel of death. He had done everyone a favour and got rid of the sort of people you would not want around, said Mr Munday. Steele and Womes were convicted after Nichols described picking them up after the murders. He said he heard Womes laughing as he recalled how his partner's gun had fallen apart during the shootings. He said Steele would describe Womes as a cold-hearted bastard who had pointed his gun into the Range Rover and put shots into all 3 immediately. Nichols said he drove Womes to the scene thinking it was simply for a drug deal meeting. He was told to wait nearby until he was called. When he returned and the front door of the car opened, Nichols states, quote, "The light came on. I saw Jack's hands. He was wearing surgical-type gloves. They were covered in speckles of something which I could see was red," he added. He took it to be blood, and then he realised what was going on. If you would like to learn more about the Range Rover murders, then click on the video in front of you now. You will also see the Essex Boys playlist, which has all of the videos concerning this case in one convenient folder. Many thanks for joining me for this video. I look forward to seeing you all again for the next one. Take care. Cheers. The following police statement is from Craig Anthony Rolfe, dated the 1st of December 1994. About 5 years ago, whilst at my friend's, Robert Emmons' flat, I met a man by the name of Kevin Whittaker. Over the years, I've got to know Kevin fairly well. Having said that, we were not particularly close, although I have done him a few favours in the past. We've only gone out socially together on one occasion, and on average I would see him 2 to 3 times a month. The last time I saw Kevin was on Tuesday the 15th of the 11th 94 around mid-afternoon, when I saw him standing in a telephone kiosk in Rectory Road, Pitsea, making a telephone call. I stopped the car I was driving, a blue Vauxhall Corsa, and had a conversation for approximately 10 to 15 minutes. I then drove off and left him to walk to Simon Smith's house. The last time I spoke to Kevin was sometime between 1500 and 1600 hours on Thursday the 17th of the 11th 94 when I phoned him from my home address to his father's address. This conversation lasted approximately 5 minutes, and all I can recall of the conversation was that he had mentioned that he had been to see his little boy in the morning. During all these conversations, at no time did Kevin mention that he was worried about anything or that he had any problems, other than the fact that he was a bit down having split up with his girlfriend. After I'd finished a conversation, I stayed at home watching the television whilst my girlfriend Donna Jaggers went to Lakeside Shopping Centre. Donna returned home approximately 6 p.m. the same day and we had our evening meal together. Having finished our meal, Donna and myself then left our home address and drove to Basildon in the blue Vauxhall Corsa, arriving there around 7 p.m. that evening at our friend's house at 1 Ames Green, Basildon. This is the home address of Steve Thomas and his girlfriend Michelle. Unfortunately, by the time we had arrived, Michelle had gone out to an aerobic class, so we only stayed for a short while, arriving home together at approximately 9 to 9:30 that evening. We watched television for a short while and then went to bed for the night. I didn't leave my house till around midday on Friday the 18th of the 11th 94, when I left my house to drive to Basildon to see friends. The following statement is from Philip Pullinger, dated the 8th of December 1995. At around 16:30 hours on Wednesday the 6th of December 1995, I was on duty in plain clothes in company with DC 2051 Williams in an unmarked police vehicle. At this time I left Grays Police Station and drove into Brook Road. As I did so, I saw a blue Range Rover, index number F424NPE, which was travelling in front of my vehicle. I was aware that Craig Rolfe was the user of this vehicle. The vehicle parked in Brook Road adjacent to the front entrance to the police station. I parked my vehicle directly behind it. I got out of my vehicle and as I did so, the driver and sole occupant of the Range Rover also got out. I recognised the driver to be a person whom I know to be Craig Rolfe. I called out to Rolfe and had a conversation with him regarding a future appointment to obtain a statement from his common law wife, Miss Jaggers. The conversation lasted for a few seconds, and as I recollect, Rolfe was wearing a black puffy leather jacket and tracksuit bottoms. I then returned to my vehicle. I did not see where Rolfe went as he walked away from his vehicle. I then left the scene. I can be certain that the male I spoke to was Craig Rolfe. Now, many of you will know that during this time period, Craig Rolfe was a disqualified driver and the Range Rover had no tax. But really the only small piece of detail that we can take from this statement in particular is what Craig Rolfe was wearing. Now, bearing in mind this sighting is at 4:30 in the afternoon, just around 2 hours before Rolfe is actually killed, supposedly. But a lot of people say, well, how could they have been dressed like that if they were going out to this meal? Why were they wearing jeans and bomber jackets and boots? Surely they were going to go home and get changed before they went out to this meal. How could they have made the meal on time? But I think they were going to literally go as they were dressed that evening, because Craig Rolfe has obviously gone off here. He's been wearing tracksuit bottoms. He's at some point in time gone home, changed his tracksuit bottoms into jeans, and then gone off to meet Tony and Pat. I believe that the way that they're dressed, they were literally just going to go straight from Rettendon to this meal. But obviously, that never happened. The next sighting of Craig Rolfe comes from Donna Jaggers, where she mentions the following in her statement. We were going out that night because they believed they were coming into money and they were going to have a pre-celebration. Craig phoned me at work in the afternoon and told me that Mickey Steele had contacted Pat Tate and said he wanted to meet with Tate and Tucker to go and look at somewhere they could land a light aircraft. Craig mentioned to me they'd been to or were going to, I can't remember which, to TGI Fridays restaurant at Lakeside. I later found out that this had been Tate, Tucker and Craig and a person called Peter Cuthbert. Craig wanted me to have something new to wear for the evening and took me to the Lakeside Shopping Centre at 17:45. He was driving the Range Rover and left to go and pick up Tony Tucker. Craig told me that he was going because he didn't want Tony to be in a position to say that he hadn't been any part in the arranging. I also understood that Craig was going to collect Tony Tucker from his house and they were going to meet Tate and Steele later. I did not have contact from Craig, Tate or Tucker after this point. Okay, now if we go a little bit further back in Donna Jaggers' statement, there's something that confuses me. It's confused me ever since I've read it and it still confuses me to this day. But just reading that part at the bottom could actually tie in with what I'm about to question here. Now, earlier on in her statement, she appears to be concerned about Craig's involvement. She tells him, look, I don't want you to have anything to do with this. This is getting out of control. Craig says to Donna the following words. He told me that Steele didn't know he was going to be driving, and he convinced me that he wasn't as heavily involved as the other two in what was going to happen. Now, what she is referring to here is the ripping off of Steele. The fact that they're going to get this consignment, they're going to cut it up into impure, then give it back to Steele. Now, when you look at Darren Nichols' statement, he also mentions that Steele is going to meet only Tate. Also mentioned at the bottom of Donna Jagger's statement is exactly the same thing. That Craig is going off to meet Tucker and they're going to meet Pat and Steele later. Now, when I read that part about Donna Jagger's being told by Craig, look, he doesn't know I'm going to be driving, I'm not as heavily involved as the other two, don't worry about it. What I took from that is that he was going to be nearby in the Range Rover whilst this deal was taking place, or whilst this robbery of the consignment was taking place. Steele wouldn't even know that he was ever there. That's the impression I get when I read that part of the statement. Not the fact that Steele doesn't know I'm going to be driving. Oh, surprise, here I am at the halfway house. That's not what I get when reading that statement. What I pick up from that statement is that Craig is saying, I would have been in the Range Rover, out of sight. Steele's not going to know I was even there. I'm not as heavily involved as Tate and Tucker. They're going to be robbing this consignment. I'm going to be there in the vehicle to drive them away. And that's what I get from that statement. I certainly don't think it's a case that he was going to turn up with Tucker and Tate at the halfway house, and then Steele's going to get in the vehicle and think, oh, Craig's driving. I wasn't expecting that. Now, this is where it gets a little bit confusing, as we have two individuals who claim that Michael Steele was going to meet Pat Tate separately. We have Darren Nichols' official version of events, stating that when he got into the vehicle, when he got into the Hilux with Mick, he said he was going to meet Pat for a deal. We also have Donna Jagger's statement, where she claims that Craig had told her that he was going to pick up Tucker and he was going to meet up with Tate later on in the evening. Now, the problem that we have is that we have the eyewitness account from Tony Tucker's common law wife that he left his property around 6 o'clock. He was picked up by Rolfe, but there was no one home at Tate's address. We don't have any independent witnesses claiming, or stating I should say, that Tate got into the vehicle with Tony Tucker and Craig Rolfe. I guess the best eyewitness account we have is from the tyre fitter leaving work. It's in his statement that he says he sees the Range Rover. He knows Craig Rolfe from school when they used to go to school together. He could identify Rolfe being the driver, Tucker in the front passenger seat, and a large man in the rear between the two front seats. He couldn't state whether this was Tate due to the fact that it was dark, but he could definitely clearly recognise Craig Rolfe driving and Tony Tucker in the passenger seat. Where things get even more confusing is the fact that in Sarah Saunders' official statement, or I should say in her police interviews, she was adamant that she was told they were going to meet Mad Mick Bowman first. Before meeting Mickey Steele, they were going to meet Mad Mick Bowman. Now, she claimed that she heard that through, I don't know whether it's Donna Jagger's or Donna Jagger's told someone else and it got back to Sarah Saunders, but this doesn't appear anywhere in Donna Jagger's official statement. So it's strange. I mean, obviously it's more than likely that it's Tate who is seen by this tyre fitter driving down the road and when they're on their way to the halfway house pub, but we can't be 100% sure. There is a very small possibility that Rolfe and Tucker were in the Range Rover and they met up with Tate later on that evening. What makes this case equally difficult but also intriguing is the telephone evidence. Now, obviously back in 1995, the technology just wasn't there to be able to pinpoint people's locations. As I've said in many previous other videos, really all we have is a very approximate location for where these individuals are on the evening of December the 6th. Now, what we have in its entirety is Rolfe without a mobile telephone. He didn't take his phone with him on December the 6th. We have quite sparse telephone information from Tucker, and we have fairly sparse information regarding Tate's mobile phone. So there is a slim possibility, as I say, that Tate may have met up with Steele beforehand and then met up with Tucker and Rolfe later on. I guess that's why I find this case just so interesting, even after 2 years of looking into it. It's the fact that the evidence that we have is by no means scientific. It's by no means 100% proven. You need to remember that regardless of whether you believe that Steele and Wombs are guilty of these crimes, everything was literally based upon the word of Darren Nichols. If you believe Darren Nichols, you believe his version of events, then of course you believe that Steele and Wombs are wholeheartedly guilty of these murders. But the fact we have this sort of telephone evidence, which is quite ambiguous, it's quite open to interpretation, We have the different sightings of a Range Rover being seen with a white car at different locations. That's what I enjoy about this case, is that it's not an open and shut case. If you look into all of the statements, it seems to be quite open-ended in places. And I'm certainly not putting this forward, this theory forward of Tate possibly meeting up with Steele first as, you know, the gospel truth or anything like that. It's just simply a possibility. Because we don't have, as I said earlier, any eyewitness stating that Tate got into that vehicle with Rolfe and Tucker, the simple fact is no one will ever really know the truth. Now, one of the last parts I want to move on to is Craig Rolfe's body position when he's found in the Range Rover on December the 7th. Now, this has to be literally one of the most talked about points in this entire case. And it wasn't until, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago that I came across something in the Summing Up in Court document which actually answered the question. Now, a lot of people, they look at the crime scene photographs, they particularly pay attention to the ones taken back at the police pound when they've recovered the Range Rover. And a lot of people say, well, why is Craig Rolfe's left foot on the brake? This is something I covered in a separate video, which is on the channel, so do feel free to check that out. But the reason, if anyone hasn't seen that video, the reason why Craig Rolfe's left foot is on the brake is not the fact that he's braking that's the issue here. It's the fact that he's braking with his left foot, which a lot of people deem to be unnatural. The problem arose actually is when they got the vehicle back to the police pound, they actually had to reposition the bodies. They had to move the steering wheel, they had to reposition the bodies as they had moved in transit from the crime scene back to the police pound. It was written in, as I say, the Summing Up in Court document, that there had to be some adjusting of the bodies, there had to be some moving of the bodies, and that is why Craig Rolfe's left foot is on the brake. It may well have been, and more than likely was, that his right foot was on the brake when they were actually discovered. The problem that we have is that we don't actually have any photographs of the interior of the Range Rover before it was actually recovered back to the police pound. And then we move on to the actual shooting itself. Now, this is yet another open-ended topic. A lot of people say that Tate was shot first to subdue him, and a lot of people say that Rolfe was shot first because he was the driver, and some people even say that Tucker was shot first. The truth of the matter, as with a lot of things in this case, is there's simply no way to prove who was shot first. That can be best used as an example when again looking at the Summing Up in Court document, where the forensic experts and the ballistic experts couldn't even agree on who was shot first. There's even a possibility that one of the bullet wounds went through one of the victims and hit the other. So the truth is, as I say, we just simply don't know. Now, from my perspective, a common sense perspective, I guess you could say, is I would imagine that Rolfe was the first person to be shot. The reason for that is because obviously he's driving the vehicle. He's the person that can get those other two occupants out of there. Really, he's the first person that needs to be taken care of. So in my opinion, the way that it's happened is that Rolfe is shot first, then Tucker, then Tate is shot in the abdomen. And what's interesting about this point in time is we're supposedly looking at someone who is committing a murder for the first time, as in Jack Womes. But whoever has committed this crime, whoever has committed this murder, whoever's pulled the trigger, has shot Tate in the abdomen, and they haven't panicked. There hasn't been, someone firing as quickly as they can and just trying to get this over and done with. Whoever's committed this crime has fired that shot into the abdomen of Tate. They've then calmly walked around the front of the vehicle to the near side rear window where they've taken aim at Pat Tate's head and then shot him again. So what I'm getting from that is that this is someone who has still got quite a good presence of mind. They're not, as I say, they're not panicking, they're not rushing, they're not overcome with adrenaline and firing off as many shots as they can and just making sure that they're dead. This is a clinical execution. Now, just to leave this video with a little bit more spice and controversy, we're going to leave you with an eyewitness account, a statement from a barman in 1996 who comes forward to the police and claims that he serves Craig Rolfe at 8 p.m. on December the 6th, over an hour after their supposed deaths. I'll leave you with this statement, and I'll see you all again in the next video. Cheers. The following statement comes from Stuart Armstrong, dated the 8th of the 3rd, 1996. Around the 10th of the 10th, 95, I started working as a barman at the Carpenter's Arms, situated off the A130 at Rolfe. The pub itself I would describe as a locals pub, with it being very cliquey. There is only the one bar area situated inside. There is not any video monitoring system inside the pub, basically because there is never any trouble. On either Tuesday the 5th of December 95 or Wednesday the 6th of December 95, and I think it was more than probably the Wednesday, I was left to mind the pub on my own. Around 1600 hours I started work. It was not very busy during the afternoon and into the evening. However, around 2000 hours it was very quiet in the bar area, in fact quieter than normal, when two men entered the bar. Both men approached the bar and I will describe them as best I can. One of them I shall refer to as male 1. I will describe this man as white, 30 years old, around 5 foot 7 inches tall. He had a stocky build. He had brown hair that was cut very short and brushed down straight, but appeared to be receding. I believe he may have been wearing a green jacket, but I'm not certain. The other male I cannot describe in any detail, other than that he was also white, but was also taller than male 1. Male 1 asked me for a bottle of Budweiser beer and a bottle of Two Dogs alcoholic lemonade. What stuck in my mind was that it was company policy to pour any bottled drinks into a glass, and as I started to pour the Budweiser into the glass, male 1 got agitated and said he wanted it kept in the bottle. I told him I couldn't and he accepted this, although he wasn't happy. Both men then went over to a table situated in the corner of the bar area near the fruit machine. Around 20 minutes later, both men left. I didn't hear any conversation between them. I was glad when they left because I was on my own. It was not until the following week that I read the Evening Echo newspaper, and in particular an article on a triple murder that had happened in Rettendon. To my surprise, one of the 3 photos of the 3 deceased I immediately recognised to be male 1 who had been drinking in the pub. The name of the person, according to the paper, was Craig Rolfe. Although I cannot describe male 2 in any detail, I can say that it was neither of the other 2 pictures in the paper of the 3 dead men. I would not be able to recognise male 2 again, and have no further information regarding his description. Neighbours of victim Tony Tucker were baffled at how he could afford a £250,000 home and a string of flash motors with no visible means of support. They suspected he was a shady character, but had no idea that he had amassed a fortune from his years at the heart of the Essex underworld. His murder stunned residents in the village of Fobbing, where the gangster owned a hacienda-style bungalow with breathtaking views across open farmland. Tucker's palatial red brick home boasts its own stables. In the front garden is a statue of a naked goddess, and Greek urns adorn the front wall. Tucker had a separate garage block for the luxury motors which were often spotted in his drive. These included at least one Mercedes. Neighbours said the drug baron had only recently moved into the house. Tucker appeared paranoid about security. He had an elaborate wall built and iron gates installed to block access to the front of the property. A sophisticated video intercom system was also fitted to vet callers, and after dark, guard dogs patrolled the ground. The detective leading the murder hunt said that Tucker had good reason to fear for his safety. Chief Superintendent Ivan Dibley said of the 3 victims, "These men had been involved with a sort of criminality where it is likely that their lives have been threatened before." Post-mortem examinations were being carried out on the bodies yesterday at Broomfield Hospital, Chelmsford. Mr. Dibley appealed for more information from the public. He said, quote, "I'd particularly like to hear from anyone who saw a vehicle leaving the farm track at White House Farm, or anybody who saw someone thumbing a lift on the A130, which runs past the farm at the relevant time." Mr. Dibley confirmed that the 3 men arrested on Thursday on suspicion of being connected with the shootings had been released without charge. As Tony Tucker's reputation as a hard man grew, so did his wealth, and the former soldier just couldn't resist showing it off. Local workers who laid carpets at his £250,000 Fobbing home recalled seeing rolls of notes lining the mantelpiece. The sum must have run into thousands. But Tucker didn't have to worry about leaving money lying around. He knew no one would dare steal it. One Sunday morning at his former house in Chafford Hundred, neighbours were disturbed by the boom 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 of loud music. Inside, a professional DJ had been hired to spin records as Tucker lounged in bed with common-law wife Anna Whitehead. He had started to live like a mafia don. Parked outside the Diamond Lode property was his new jet black top-of-the-range Porsche with the number plate TT9. A year later, in autumn 1995, Tucker had enough money to buy the fobbing house, but he would only live in it for 2 months. It was called Brymount Lodge and came complete with a sophisticated video intercom to vet callers and guard dogs which patrolled after dark. Tucker ran a lucrative security agency which allowed him to pocket a share of the profits from drugs sold at clubs where he ran the door. He was responsible for the infamous Raquel's nightclub in Basildon when the ecstasy tablet that killed teenager Leah Betts was bought there. As the money rolled in, he started injecting a cocktail of steroids and cocaine, and this regime of terror began. A former associate revealed Tucker kept horses stabled near Basildon. He discovered the owner of the stables was in debt and made discreet inquiries to find out who was owed money. Armed with this information, Tucker sent a group of heavies into the riding school bar. It was smashed to pieces with iron rods. The next day, Tucker went to the owner and said he had heard there was trouble and knew who was behind it. He told him if he could stable his horses for free, he would ensure that there was no more violence. A Stanford plumber also had good reason to remember Tucker. He and his son fitted a shower at his new fobbing home. Later, they had a call from Tucker saying it needed fixing. The plumber told him it must be a faulty part and he would contact the manufacturers. Tucker's reply was simple. "You obviously don't know who I am, you better get round here now." Firstly, let's start with a statement from a waitress at TGI Fridays. The following statement is from Linda Wolfe, dated the 11th of December 1995. I've worked as a waitress at TGI Fridays restaurant situated at Lakeside Shopping Centre complex in West Thurrock since April this year. My work entails the taking of orders and serving of food and drink to customers who attend the restaurant. TGI's is an American-themed burger and steak restaurant and also has a large bar centred within the premises. There are a large number of staff members and we all know each other as we spend so much time working at the restaurant. On Wednesday, the 6th of December 1995, I started a day shift at work and arrived at 10 a.m. I would normally work until 6 p.m. It is normally fairly quiet during the day and only starts to get busy in the evening. On this day, I had 5 tables to cover. I cannot be precise with the time, but around 1 p.m. in the afternoon, 4 men were seated at one of my allocated tables, table number 50. I can't remember who brought them to my table, but someone would be responsible for seeing them at the entrance door and seating them to a table of suitable choice. As soon as they sat down, Helen Smith, another staff member, approached the men and asked them if they wanted a drink. The man ordered 3 bottles of Beck's beer and a Diet Pepsi. I went over to the table and made sure the drinks had been ordered, and then went over to enter the drinks onto the till as we keep a computer record of the order. I will describe the men as follows. One of them, whom later introduced himself to me as Tony Tucker, he was white, mid-30s, he was very tall and had a stocky build. He had collar-length hair that was brown, long at the sides and short at the front. He was wearing a black bomber jacket and had a mobile phone, but I couldn't tell you what make. The next man, whom I shall refer to as Pat, was white, mid to late 30s, he was slightly taller than Tony and had a very large build. He had short hair that was greying but was brown in colour. He was wearing a long curved gold necklace outside his top. I can't remember his clothing, but he also had a mobile phone. The third man, whom I shall refer to as the younger one, was white, 26 to 28 years old. He was tall but not as large as the others, but he had a very well built physique. He had dark, possibly black hair that was very short in a French crop style. I remember he was wearing a very nice V-neck jumper, green and orange in colour. It stuck out as it was very nice. The fourth male I shall refer to as the quiet one, as he didn't say much and seemed very moody. He was also white. He appeared older than the others, perhaps late 30s, early 40s. He had a similar large build. He was very well built. He had wavy grey coloured hair, but I can't be sure as to the length, and stubble on his face. He was wearing a bright yellow coloured nylon bomber jacket that was zip-up. The young ones said they were all hungry and they wanted to order straight away. Tony ordered a fajita baguette. Pat ordered mushroom steak, mushroom with a baked potato. The young one ordered pasta Santa Fe with garlic bread, and the fourth male in the yellow ordered fajita baguette as well. Apart from the fourth male in the yellow jacket, the other 3 were mucking around, generally taking the piss.
They kept asking me to let my hair down, and eventually after their constant pestering I did so. Tony said words to the effect of, "Oh yeah, nice. You've got to come to Berwick Manor on Friday. Ask for Tony Tucker. Tony Tucker. It's easy. It rolls off the tongue." I said I might, but to be honest I had to work on Friday and needed the money. I mentioned to Tony that I knew a bloke that worked at Hollywood's nightclub in Romford, and Tony used his mobile to ring and try and find out who, but his phone wouldn't work, so he used Pat's. He finally got through and asked if they had a bouncer called Boise. Someone must have given a name of who this was, as Tony said, "What, Mick?" He laughed and said, "Sack him." He then laughed and said, "Only joking." At the end of their meal, Pat said to me, "Get Claire to ring me." I believe that Pat was asking if Claire could serve them. Claire Carey was who he meant, but she was not working that day. I said, "Has she got your number?" He said sharply, "Course she has." The bill came to around £56. Tony put down 70 quid cash, and Pat also put down a tenner. The fourth man just sat there and remained quiet throughout the meal, but he definitely seemed moody, although the other three were not ignoring him and didn't appear upset with him. All four left approximately an hour later. This left me with around £25 in tips, which I was really pleased about. I didn't see what car they went to, and this was the last time I saw them. However, I've subsequently been reading the national newspapers, and I've seen Tony Pat's and the young one's pictures in the paper as being shot and killed. They were definitely the same three who I served that day. I have not seen the fourth man in the papers, but I believe I would recognise him again. Interestingly enough, in this statement from the waitress, she mentions there at some point in time that Tony Tucker's mobile phone wasn't working, so he asked to borrow Pat's. You'll understand why that becomes important a little bit later on in this video. But from here, many people have the false impression that they received a phone call at Timberlog Lane, and that's to meet up later that evening. But that's not correct. There's actually another place they go to after TGI Fridays. I believe that Peter Cuthbert goes his separate way, and Tucker, Tate and Rolfe head to a carpet shop on Timberlog Lane. The following statement is from Mark Harding, dated the 9th of December 1995. I'm employed at LT Carpets Limited at their site at 198 Timberlog Lane, Basildon. From there, the company sells carpets to the public. I've worked at LT Carpets for around 12 years. I've seen people that are now known as Tony Tucker, Pat Tate and Craig Rolfe on a few occasions. On the 29th of the 11th, 95, the three of them all came in together. They had a look around and then Tony Tucker made an order to recarpet a flat at 108 Mill Green, Basildon. It had already been measured and he wanted it fitted by the weekend. The total was £800. Tony paid a £100 deposit, leaving a balance of £700. The carpet was fitted on Friday the 1st of the 12th 95 by Steve Carter, who works out of our Dagenham shop. I asked him to pick up the balance of the money because I didn't want to have to try and chase up these people for the money. I haven't had any problems with any of them, but you hear stories about them, and they're all big people that you wouldn't like to argue with. After Steve had fitted the carpet, he came away without getting the money. So I had to phone up Tony Tucker to get the balance. He had given me his telephone number as 0385 317 327. I phoned him 3 times. I got through to him twice on that number. The other time the call was diverted and I left a message for him. When I spoke to Tony, he was apologetic and promised to get me the money. It's around 1:30 p.m. to 2 p.m. on Wednesday the 6th of the 12th, 1995, the same 3 people, Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, came into the yard. They came in a blue Range Rover. They all got out, just walking about, whilst Tony came into the office and paid the £700 balance by cheque. After finishing the paperwork, they then left. Tony didn't really say anything, only sorry for messing us about. The invoice has been sent over to our main office in Peacock Road, Basildon. The cheque was banked with our day's takings that evening. I'm not certain which bank they use. It's after leaving the carpet shop that this story starts to take a bit of a more bizarre twist. Now, I covered this very recently, but for the purposes of this video, it's important for me to go over it again. Tony Tucker on his mobile receives a telephone call at 14:29 from the payphone at the Sorrel Horse Inn in Ipswich. Now, this is widely believed to be the call that was summoning them to a meeting later that evening, which led to their murders. Now, what I find interesting about these calls is that we've always been told that it wasn't actually Tony Tucker who was the prime target. He wasn't the prime motivation behind this triple murder. Now, what is also interesting about these telephone calls is that we're not just looking at one here. We have the original phone call from the payphone at the Sorrel Horse Inn to Tucker's mobile. Then he appears to head to the payphone on Timberlog Lane to call this number back at 14:32. Just a few seconds later, the payphone at the Sorrel Horse Inn is again calling Tucker's mobile. Now, in the book Blogs 19, which was co-written by Darren Nichols, it's claimed in there that this is Jack Womes making these telephone calls. Coincidentally, that the actual payphone at the Sorrel Horse Inn is incredibly close to where Jack Womes was working at the time. But did Jack Womes really know Tucker? Would he be calling Tony Tucker to arrange the meeting for later that evening? There's other people that believe that this was Steele trying to contact Tucker to arrange yet again the meet for later that night. Now, how you choose to interpret these telephone calls is down to you. If you believe this is completely innocent, this is simply Michael Steele who couldn't get hold of Pat Tate at the time, ringing Tony Tucker and organising the meet for later that evening, that's absolutely fine. Or you may wish to have a more sinister view of these phone calls. We've heard in previous videos of a slight strain in the relationship between Tucker and Tate. And did this impact on Michael Steele's plans? Now, if this is actually Michael Steele making these calls, is he arranging something with Tucker here that Tate was unaware of? It's also wholeheartedly possible that this isn't even Steele at all, or Jack Womes making these telephone calls to Tony Tucker. Now, this is going to border on the edge of conspiracy theory, and I'm fine with that. I'm okay with that. Because what I find strange when looking at the crime scene, looking at the way that Tony Tucker's body is positioned in that Range Rover, he looks incredibly relaxed, as if he hasn't had a shock, he's not surprised by anything. But ultimately, he is also dead along with the other two members in that car. So what could possibly explain that? Could it have been that Tucker actually knew what was going on that evening and his job was to get Tate down the lane along with Steele or someone else? Could it have been that he was expecting Tate to be shot, therefore his body position is that of a relaxed person? Or could it simply be that his body position is like that because that's the way it fell after being shot with the shotgun? Now, because this case is quite open-ended in a lot of places, it does allow, I believe, for a little bit of assumption and possibly imagination in certain areas. Now, hopefully this doesn't come across as me being a conspiracy theorist or trying to push out false narratives or false ideas, but we have to ask ourselves, why is it Tucker that is receiving these telephone calls? The whole basis for this case that was put forward by the prosecution was that Michael Steele was under threat from Tate. Michael Steele was receiving threats. Tate was causing Michael Steele a great deal of trouble regarding the dud cannabis deal. It was decided that Tate had to go. Tucker doesn't even figure in this case in terms of a motive for murder. It just happened to be that Tucker was close to Tate and Tucker also got killed along with him. So why are these calls, the calls that are supposedly to actually arrange the meetup for later that evening, why are those telephone calls going to Tucker's mobile? Now, playing devil's advocate again here for one moment, could it be that Steele and Tucker actually deemed Tate to be the weak link in the chain? We had Tucker, who was a businessman to some degree. He was able to sell the product. We had Steele, who was able to import it off his own back, quite an intelligent guy. And we have Tate sort of sitting in the middle here, kind of like the muscle. But interestingly, when we take a look at Donna Garwood's statement, who was Tucker's then girlfriend, her brother actually mentioned that Tucker had said to her that Tate had done something which he was worried reflected badly on himself. Tucker was concerned by Tate's actions. Could it have been that either Tucker approached Steele and said, look, what do we need Tate for? He's causing us all this trouble. We've just had the Leah Bet situation. He's being too loud. We can work together. We can split the profits. We'll make a lot more money without him. And could it have been that that's how Steele got all three of them down the lane? This is all bearing in mind if Steele was actually involved. And as I say, it could well be, and it more than likely is, that Tucker, Tate and Rolfe were all completely unaware that night of what they were there for, and they were subsequently executed rapidly. It's also worth remembering that if this deal had any truth to it, if this deal was actually going to happen, this £1 million deal, that £1 million was worth a great deal of money, particularly back in 1995. Was Tucker the sort of greedy person who would have taken Steele up on such an offer to get rid of Tate and split the profit between them? Also, never underestimate the importance of the Leah Betts situation. Leah Betts, who died on November the 16th, 1995, and the press and the publicity that then generated. The pressure, to some degree, was really coming down on Tucker during this time period. To end this video, I'm going to leave you with an eyewitness account of the last known sighting of Tony Tucker on December the 6th, 1995. The following is a short statement from Anna Marie Whitehead. The date, the 7th of December, 1995. The time, 1500 hours. I last saw Tony at 6 p.m. when he was picked up from my house by Craig Rolfe in the blue Range Rover. We were supposed to be going for a meal at the Global Caf, South Street, Romford last night, but he never returned. Tony was wearing jeans, Saatchi white vest, a fleecy North Sails jumper / sweatshirt, and Caterpillar boots. He was carrying a Nokia mobile phone, telephone number 0385 317 327. I later left a message on his answer machine at 8 p.m. He would have had his address book / diary with him. The following newspaper article is from the 29th of February 1996 with the headline, Jealous Drugs Boss Shot His Own Pal. Murdered drug baron Tony Tucker has been blamed for shooting his own friend Pat Tate and then supplying him with a gun and drugs while he was recovering in hospital. The fateful alleged shooting came a year before both men were slaughtered. Tucker, who was slain alongside Tate and Craig Rolfe on a deserted farm track in Rettendon last December, either carried out the 1994 shooting himself or arranged it and then planted the gun on one of Tate's other pals, it is claimed. A friend of Tate claims Tucker was jealous of Tate's friendship with the other man. The shooting paints a picture of Tucker as a jealous man, capable of doing anything to make sure he got his own way. The incident happened in 1994 as Pat Tate was at home preparing to go to Tucker's party in London. He was in his bathroom shaving when the glass was shattered by a bullet which hit him in the arm. Tate's friend, a woman who does not want to be identified for fear of reprisal, says Tucker stoked Tate's fear and paranoia after the shooting by giving him a gun to protect himself while he was in hospital. She also claims that Tucker supplied Tate with drugs while he was in his hospital bed. The gun which fired the bullet was then allegedly planted at the home of a friend of Tate's. The pal was allegedly questioned about the shooting, but no one was ever charged. Tate had not long been out of prison when the bathroom shooting occurred. He had been jailed in November 1990 for 6 years for robbery and drugs charges, but was let out in July 1994 on licence. When the pistol and drugs were found, Tate's licence was revoked and he was sent back to prison to serve the remainder of his sentence. He was finally released on October the 31st last year, weeks before he and the two other men were shot dead, their bodies discovered in a Range Rover. Police believe the Rettendon shooting was part of a drugs turf war. Tate's mother Marie confirmed that Tucker had supplied her son with drugs and the gun which was found under his hospital bed. She said, quote, Pat could see no wrong in Tony, even when Pat was caught with the drugs and the gun. Tony said he would own up and take the blame to keep Pat out of prison, but he never did. The following newspaper article is from the 9th of the 9th, 1997, with the headline, Forensic Scientist Describes How Trio Were Killed. 3 men killed in the Range Rover murders were each shot once from point-blank range before 5 other wounds were inflicted, probably with a pump-action shotgun that the Old Bailey heard yesterday. Forensic scientist John Burns concluded this occurred to prevent any escapes or attempts to hinder the shooting. Quote, it appeared the incident happened extremely quickly. 1 shot was fired at each victim before further shots were fired. Most of the shots appear to have been fired at close range through the open rear offside door of the vehicle. Each of the men had received shotgun wounds to the head. There was much blood in the vehicle with splattering of blood and tissue on many of the surfaces, he added. Mr. Andrew Munday, prosecuting, told the court the incident occurred after a dispute in relation to drug dealing following a consignment of cannabis from Holland which had brought complaints all round.
Michael Steele, 54, of St Mary's Road, Great Bentley, and Jack Womes, 35, of Main Road, Brockford, Suffolk, have pleaded not guilty to murdering all three men whose bodies were found on December 7th, 1995. Mr. Burns' estimate of the range was within 2 feet or so of a damaged headrest, and added it was consistent with the same shot having caused injury to the head or neck. Tate, slumped in the back seat, had a superficial wound caused to the back of the head, resulting in damage to the scalp, and there was a large shotgun entry wound behind the left ear. He also had an entry wound to the left side of the chest. Front seat passenger Tucker had an entry wound to the back of the head, about level of the ears, and 2 wounds to the side of the face. The driver Rolfe had an entry wound behind the top of the right ear and an entry wound at the side of the right neck.
Now we're led to believe by not only the prosecution but in documentaries and films which are shown on TV that Tucker, Tate and Rolfe entered Workhouse Lane with an occupant in the rear of the Range Rover, a 4th passenger. The Range Rover itself travelled down the length of Workhouse Lane on December 6, 1995. When that Range Rover reaches the 5-bar locked gate, the rear occupant behind Craig Rolfe gets out of the vehicle in order to go and open this gate. During the time that the rear door is open, a gunman approaches from nearby bushes and executes Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. This crime was committed in a matter of seconds, minutes at most. Not one of the 3 deceased ever leave the Range Rover once it enters Workhouse Lane. So then how do we explain the presence of mud on the bottom of Tony Tucker's boots? Now, once we are faced with that following photograph of Tony Tucker's boots with mud on the bottom of them, the next question should be, do we have any transference from these boots into the inside of the Range Rover? If this was quite a fresh occurrence of Tucker being outside in the lane, you would imagine that that mud would have been wet to have stuck to Tucker's boots. It would have then been transferred into the front footwell of the Range Rover. Now, interestingly, when we take a look at the next photograph of the front footwell where Tucker is situated, we do have a stain here in the front footwell. This matches up in both colour and texture to that of the mud which is found on the bottom of Tucker's boots. Now, the presence of mud on his boots and in the front footwell shouldn't be enough to immediately make you believe that Tucker got out of the vehicle at any point during his journey down the lane. This mud may have been picked up from the first part of the journey in the Range Rover before they'd even reached Workhouse Lane itself. Now, the next port of call is to actually look at the crime scene as a whole. We need to look for any item or any vehicle which may have travelled down the whole length of the farm track so that we can see if any drying mud is present so that we can compare it with the mud that has dried on Tucker's boots and in the front footwell of the Range Rover. Well, luckily enough, we have the Range Rover which has travelled the full length of the farm track, and on the side wall of the Range Rover we have drying mud. Now, if we compare this mud with the mud which is found on Tucker's boots and is found in the front footwell of the Range Rover, we have a very credible match. Now, some people watching this video may believe that mud is just mud. It could have come from anywhere. But that's not quite the case, because mud varies from location to location, especially in clay content. It can dry at a certain speed, dry at a certain colour. And what we have here between the sidewall of the Range Rover, the outside of the vehicle, and what is found on the inside, as in the footwell and the soles of Tucker's boots, in my opinion, is a very close match to that of the mud found down the lane. Now, what I'm going to do for you next is read to you a newspaper article from the Express, which is dated May 2018. And in this article, John Womes, and that's Jack Womes' brother, so Jack Womes being one of the convicted men in this case, his brother actually appears in this article and makes mention of the mud and the soil samples being collected from the crime scene itself. I will read this article to you in its entirety, and I will make sure that I point out the part that discusses the mud when we get to it. Essex Boys murderers in new bid for freedom amid claims evidence was not disclosed. 2 men convicted of the Essex Boys murders have launched a new appeal after a shed full of undisclosed evidence was allegedly uncovered. Michael Steele, 75, and Jack Womes, 56, were jailed for life in January 1998 after being found guilty of the Rettendon Range Rover murders of Essex drug barons Patrick Tate, 37, Tony Tucker, 38, and Craig Rolfe, 26. Their bodies were found in a Range Rover parked in a remote farm track in Rettendon Essex on the morning of December 7th, 1995. The slayings have been the subject of several British gangster feature films which have speculated about what actually happened. Womes from Brockford, Suffolk and Steele of Great Bentley, Essex were involved in drug deals with the murdered gangsters but have always denied killing them. The pair have launched a new bid for freedom with an application to the Criminal Cases Review Commission based on claims of non-disclosure of evidence before the trial. Police and Crown Prosecution Service non-disclosure of evidence is currently being looked at in an inquiry by MPs on the Justice Committee, after a series of rape prosecutions collapsed due to late disclosure of unused evidence that supported the defence's cases. Womes and Steele's prosecution was based around the word of Supergrass Darren Nichols, 49, another Essex Boys gang member who was placed into witness protection after claiming in court he was their getaway driver after the murders. It also centred on the phone records which placed Womes and Steele in the area and in contact with Tate in the run-up to the killings. Womes' brother John Womes, 56, from Suffolk, told the Sunday Express newly disclosed phone evidence formed part of the fresh action. He said, quote, "At the trial we wanted everything that was unused as evidence, but it turns out we were never given everything, and now we have got that. I'm 110% sure that the non-disclosure will take us to an immediate appeal." Mr. Womes said the new material could fill a shed or room of 10 metres by 8. He added, quote, "It includes everything, even soil samples from the scene and from boots and tyres. We are more than delighted. It is coming up to 23 years now, but I have said we will win, because I will fight to the death, and we are getting near the end." Solicitor David Wells of Wells Burkham, who is representing the pair, tweeted, "Jack Womes and Michael Steele, the so-called Essex Boys convicted of the Rettendon murders in 1998, have both today formally requested the CCRC to review their convictions based on significant non-disclosure." Now back to the article itself, it goes on to state the following. The CCRC has to accept the new application, but if no new evidence is contained, it could quickly be dismissed. The CCRC previously referred the case for appeal in 2004, but the court upheld the convictions. In the mid-2000s, the CCRC looked at another appeal, but did not refer the case to court. Then in 2015, another approach to the CCRC was rejected as a subsequent court bid to overturn that decision. Now, what I find most interesting about that article is John Womes talking about some of the unused evidence, some of the evidence he has which neither the public nor myself have ever seen. It's interesting he mentions the soil samples, not only the soil samples, but samples taken from the boots and the tyres of that vehicle. Is he trying to tell us here that they did actually match? It showed that Tucker got outside the vehicle, therefore the official narrative of them simply driving down to the locked 5-bar gate and then being executed within seconds could simply not be true. Now, given the fact that the Range Rover has travelled the full length of Workhouse Lane and the mud that you see on that vehicle is most definitely from Workhouse Lane, the Range Rover is the biggest indicator that the mud that we see on Tony Tucker's boots may well have originated from Workhouse Lane. It is very similar in colour, in texture, and we know that that mud must have been wet on the bottom of Tucker's boots for it to have then transferred into the front footwell of that Range Rover. Now back to the point in hand, why would Tony Tucker have even got outside the vehicle? Does it even matter why he got out of the vehicle? Well, really, realistically, it doesn't matter why he was outside the vehicle. All we are looking for is evidence which casts doubt upon the official narrative used by the prosecution. And it's the same narrative which is being told in the films and recent documentaries. To be able to have any other credible reason or suspect in this case, you need to first be able to disprove the official narrative which convicted Michael Steele and Jack Womes. Now, what we can say for certain is that we have 2 eyewitness accounts, one from Rebecca Carr and one from the farmer's wife, Frances Theobald, that state a Range Rover matching that description along with a white vehicle pulling off of Main Road into White House Farm car park. These 2 vehicles don't stop in the car park, they simply do a big loop and then enter back onto the main road the way they had just come from. That is in the direction of where this small farm track is located. Did they overshoot the lane? Did Tucker then get out of the vehicle at the entrance to Workhouse Lane to make sure that they were in the right direction? Did Tucker simply get out of the Range Rover to take a phone call? or have a piss in the bushes. It doesn't actually matter why he got out of the vehicle. All we are looking for is something which can cast reasonable doubt on the official narrative that these three individuals simply drove to the end of Workhouse Lane to the locked 5-bar gate and were executed within seconds. I believe if these soil samples come back as positive between the boots of Tucker and the tyres of the Range Rover, we have an answer. They were either there for a little bit longer or a lot longer than we were ever told, or there was another reason as to why Tucker exited the Range Rover. Now, there are a few things that I can be fairly certain of, and one of those is that Tucker didn't exit the Range Rover when it reached its final stationary position. What gives me that impression is when we look at the outside of Tucker's door, we do have a footprint here, but it's facing in the wrong direction. This was more than likely left by the gunman. We also have a large amount of snow and no other footprints visible. We must remember that Tucker would have needed to have walked in one of the tracks to have got that mud on the bottom of his shoes or boots in the first place. In my opinion, Tucker has more than likely got out of the lane at the start of Workhouse Lane, or maybe on the first bend, to make sure that he's in the right lane. If we also take a look at the side of Tucker's door when it reaches its final stationary position, we can see that it's quite a tight squeeze. There's a lot of vegetation. It wouldn't be very feasible for Tucker to have got out in that location and left no footprints. Another couple of things that I can be fairly certain about regarding Tony Tucker exiting the vehicle is that he wouldn't have spent a great deal of time outside of that Range Rover, and he certainly wouldn't have been chased by anyone. Now, the reason I have that opinion is because the bottom of his jeans remain largely clean. If he was being chased by anyone, or if he had covered a long distance on foot, you'd have expected to have seen that mud splash up from the boots to the bottom of those jeans. But as you can see here, those jeans remain largely clean. So to summarise, without actually seeing the soil sample results myself, I can't be 100% convinced that the mud found on Tucker's boots definitely originated from Workhouse Lane. But in my opinion, we certainly have a lot of factors here pointing towards that being a distinct possibility. Does it matter if Tucker even got out the vehicle at all? In my opinion, yes it does, because we have an official narrative put forward not only by Darren Nichols, but by the prosecution in this case, which claims that the Range Rover simply turned off of Main Road, it travelled the full length of Workhouse Lane with these three occupants inside, and then they were simply executed. If Tucker at some stage got out of that vehicle for however long, it would mean that the official narrative was incorrect.
The mother of murdered Pat Tate has claimed that her son was no drugs baron and died trying to protect his friend targeted for a revenge killing. Pat, 37, of Gordon Road, Basildon, was one of the trio found shot dead in a Range Rover in Rettendon early on Thursday, December the 7th. They were believed to have been lured to their deaths by a rival gang. But his mother Marie, 56, said the 6'3", 18-stone heavyweight had only attended the risky undercover meeting to support his pal Tony Tucker. She is convinced Tony, 38, of High Road Fobbing, and the other victim Craig Rolfe, 26, of Calshot Avenue, Chafford 100, were taken out by drugs rivals in a revenge attack for the drugs death of Kevin Whittaker in November 1994. She is emphatic that her son was not involved in that. Chelmsford coroner Dr. Malcolm Weir recorded an open verdict into Kevin's death after his drugged body was found in a ditch in Dunton, but his parents always claimed he must have been murdered by being made to take an overdose. Kevin's father Bert said, quote, "We believe Rolfe and Tucker were involved, but nobody came forward to say how it happened. Tucker was definitely at the inquest and Craig Rolfe had a warrant served on him to attend. He said Rolfe denied at the inquest that he knew Kevin, but was shown phone bills proving that his number had been rung from Kevin's house. And he added, quote, "We heard there was a contract out on Rolfe and Tucker, but how and if they did this to Kevin, we don't know." The toxicologist told us he didn't know how it wasn't a murder verdict at the inquest because of the amount of lignocaine, one of the drugs involved. Kevin was anti-needles, he hated them. Somebody administered this, but we don't know how or why. Mrs. Tate alleged that Kevin was caught up in a deal with a Romford drugs gang involving £60,000 worth of cannabis, for which he would have been paid just £2,000. But she claimed Craig and Tony wanted to stop Kevin talking. She said they injected him with a substance nicknamed Special K, a paralysing drug used on horses. She said, quote, "This paralysed his body but not his brain. They followed it up with what they told him was a line of cocaine which completely finished him off. He was only used to smoking bits of cannabis." Mrs. Tate said Pat was in hospital at the time. Craig Rolfe and Tony Tucker told him about it and thought it was funny. But Pat was in hospital after an attempt on his own life by someone else. He was shot while out on parole from an earlier prison sentence, and he forfeited that freedom after a nurse found a gun under his bed and he was jailed again. He had only been out of prison 5 weeks when he was killed. Mrs. Tate said, "People keep saying that he was a drugs baron, but he wasn't. He was no angel, but he wasn't one of the people that goes round to nightclubs selling e-tablets. Pat was warned about going to that meeting in Rettendon, but he went to protect Tony. Because he was such a big man, he thought that nothing could happen to him. He and Tony idolised each other." A total of 40 officers are currently working on the case to find the triple murderer. Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley, who is leading the inquiry, said, "We would be interested to hear from Mrs. Tate if she has information she feels would be of use to our inquiries." The following newspaper article is from the 1st of March 1996 with the headline, "Drug War Alert." An all-out gang war to settle control of the drug trade in South Essex was the grim prospect portrayed by police bosses for TV viewers at the weekend. The dire warning came on Sunday's London weekend television programme London Tonight, which showed violence among the drug barons of South Essex spiralling out of control. Essex police have now confirmed that the battle against the drug trade has become their top priority. According to police, more murder and mutilation in answer to the assassination of Basildon gangsters Pat Tate, Craig Rolfe and Tony Tucker at Rettendon last December is expected soon. Superintendent Ivan Dibley, who is leading the inquiry into the Rettendon shooting, said, "When 3 people of this calibre are murdered, there will be no shortage of people wanting to take their place. Violent reprisals from the friends of the deceased or from someone close to one of those murdered must be expected." Also screened was the horrific tale of drugs, torture and extortion surrounding recently jailed Jason Vella and his Basildon and Tilbury-based gang. An Essex police spokesman said, quote, "The arrest of drug traffickers is one of our key objectives. We are holding a major conference on March the 20th with other agencies, including educationalists and the probation service, to see how we can tackle the drugs problem." The following newspaper article was from the 7th of March 1996 with the headline, "The Hit." They have a new parlour game in the Essex village of Rettendon, and no one plays it better than Peter Theobald and his wife Frances. Murder Mystery is a game of mental gymnastics, its aim to formulate a theory, necessarily incredible, to weave the few known facts into a complete account of what happened 300 yards from their living room. The Theobalds from Farming Stock were at it again the other night over tea and walnut cake. He wondered why there was so little mess when he made his discovery on an icy winter's morning. She was struggling to explain how they could have driven to the remote spot behind their White House farm during the evening rush hour as police supposed, and why nobody had seen them as they waited for several minutes before completing the right turn in their Range Rover. Quote, "Perhaps they were already dead," she suggested, returning to one of her favourite themes. There were 3 bodies, victims of a shotgun assassin as they sat in the lane. Craig Rolfe, 26, was in the driver's seat. His boss, Tony Tucker, 38, friend to the stars, was in the front passenger seat, and in the back was Tucker's boyhood friend, Pat Tate. It was a fearsome crime, except many locals thought good riddance to drugs rubbish. They were drug dealers, but none was Mr. Big, even in Essex. They were speculating at the spanking new police station in South Woodham Ferrers. It has a lovely new incident room, and as the officers moved out after investigating the death of teenager Leah Betts, it seemed only right Ivan Dibley and his squad of 40 should move in. The station was officially opened 3 weeks after their murder inquiry got underway. The forum for a classic detective story. Some detectives believed the gunman was in the Range Rover with his victims. His 3-shot pump-action 12-bore shotgun, a little sawn off perhaps, picked up at the murder spot as he clambered out to open a gate. Others think he stepped out of the shadows after the Range Rover's occupants were lured to Workhouse Lane, regular home to courting couples. Others still favour a hybrid. The gunman was indeed waiting, but the man who ordered the murders had hired a professional hitman and arrived with the others in the back seat, a trusted colleague or friend. They died in under 2 seconds, and only one, Tate, seemed to know anything about it. How much, as almost everything in this case, is conjecture. A post-mortem examination highlighted a combination in his bloodstream of heroin, cocaine and cannabis. He was, after all, an 18-stone bodybuilder. A room darkened as he entered it, one associate was to remark. There were, in the first few weeks, an array of flowers left at the scene, mysteriously dropped by unseen hands in the dead of night. One paid tribute to the man on the back seat, who took 2 shots to his head and 1 in the stomach. A wonderful man, it read. Poison did this to you. Nearly 3 months on, there are no more flowers. Ivan Dibley, 50, one of 3 detective superintendents in Essex, was on a day off on December the 7th last year. He was breakfasting at home in Chelmsford when the call came just before 8:30 a.m. He reacted calmly, going off to the shops to do his early morning chores before taking over the investigation. He had headed more than 25 murder investigations in the previous 5 years. It rankled that 2 remained unsolved. But 1995 had been a good year. He had cleared up 10 murders in as many months. He had never headed a triple murder inquiry before. It dawned on him that this, his biggest case, was to be his last. He was retiring at the end of April after 32 years in the force. Only 30 minutes had elapsed since Ken Jiggins, 47, arrived at Peter Theobald's door, ready to help his friend feed the 800 pheasants kept in fields at the 130-acre farm. Theobald ran a shooting range, and the birds had to be fed twice a day. Jiggins was a bricklayer, and the frost was too severe to work that day. They skipped tea, and Theobald started up the Land Rover, scraping thick ice from its windows. It had begun snowing about 4 p.m. the previous day, and continued into the early hours when frost had set in. They drove across the field, maybe 300 yards, and turned left into Workhouse Lane. There, in front of a locked gate leading to an angler's carp pond and the shooting area, was a metallic blue Range Rover. Its windows, despite the ice, were clear, and the pair could see 2 men in the front seats. They looked asleep, and Jiggins jumped out to ask them to move aside. Theobald was wondering if they were poachers, when Jiggins, who had tapped on the driver's window, shouted out, "There are 2 dead men here." He used his mobile phone to alert the police, while Theobald went to check. As well as the 2 in the front, he saw another man dead in the back, slumped across the seat. He looked more closely at the driver, still with his hands on the steering wheel, and, he later learned, his foot on the brake. There was a round 2-inch entry wound behind his ear, exiting out of his mouth. Familiar with firearms, Theobald was astonished to learn that the men had been slain by shotgun, and that each had 2 wounds to the head. There was some blood seeping from the Range Rover, but nothing like the mess he would have expected. His favoured murder mystery scenario was to posit a killer in the back seat, shooting the men in the front from 6 inches with the rifle pointing down. But that left his fellow players wondering what his backseat companion was doing as the shots were fired. Maybe he thought he was in on the hit, or perhaps he was too drugged to react. Rolfe, a father of a 7-year-old daughter, was the first to die, police believe. A small-time hood, he was the driver, and the automatic gear shift was still switched to drive. The ignition was off, but said Dibley he looked as if he had pulled up at a set of traffic lights. Alongside him was his boss Tucker, minder to ex-WBC super middleweight champion Nigel Benn. He ran a lucrative security agency for clubs around Essex and East London, and pocketed maybe £1,500 a week. Like the others, he had a fine lifestyle, living in a £250,000 home and driving fancy cars. He was like scores in Essex in the drugs business, a wholesaler who never dirtied his hands. He was big in Basildon, but hardly serious enough to merit such special treatment. His bouncer business gave him the outlets, and Rolfe, who had a cocaine problem, was a trusted gopher, no more. Tate, who had a 2-year-old son, was out of prison for no more than 6 weeks when he died. He had a much more serious criminal record than the others, including convictions for drug offences and armed robbery. He had once escaped from the courthouse at Billericay, making off on a motorcycle driven by an accomplice. Heading for Spain, he made the mistake of visiting Gibraltar and was extradited back. He was out of prison on parole and enjoying a shave when the gunman came. He threw a brick through the window and as Tate reacted, fired once. It hit Tate in the arm and he was taken to hospital. Staff discovered his secret stash of drugs and his handgun beneath his pillow. Tate's licence was revoked and he was returned to prison. Tucker, a friend from childhood, looked after his second-hand car business. One man questioned over that attack was Stephen Ellis. He raced off to a new identity in the West Country in apparent fear of reprisal and took to wearing body armour. He popped up a few days after the triple murder with a suspiciously graphic account of how they died. The trio had been given a choice, death by a single shot or through hacking, bit by bit. Tucker and Tate had messed their trousers. Great tale, little of it true. When Tate had come out of prison, Tucker wanted to give him a place in his drugs organisation, more of a franchise operation than an independent outfit. But as even his mother admits, Tate was a liability. Tucker and Rolfe were hardly adverse to beating up those who crossed them, but Tate, a violent man driven crazy by drugs, was out of control. The night before he died, he telephoned the London pizza company at Basildon. He told Roger Ryle, 21, the manager, he wanted a specially made pizza with 4 different toppings on each quarter. Ryle was busy and he was annoyed at the caller's attitude. He hung up. Tate was there within minutes. He picked up the till, smashed it against a wall. He punched Ryle, then smashed his head into a glass plate on the sink. Ryle, like others crossed by the trio, declined to press charges. After the murders, the rumours flew. One suggestion was they were trying to muscle in on someone else's patch. Another had them heavily in debt. And a third indicated they had been double-crossed after hiring a £20,000 hitman to take out a rival drugs dealer. There was one claim that it was a revenge attack for Leah Bett's death, with Tucker probably the ultimate dealer, and another which made Dibley chuckle, quote, "There are members of the public who even think the police did it. Bollocks. None of the dead men's families is talking. They have a good idea. But they are afraid." Dibley, with a team of 15 detectives, says, quote, "The public aren't too happy either about so much time being spent on such lowlife. But my job isn't to moralise. The killers have to be caught. There is to be no tit for tat yet, and that has surprised me a little. But some intelligence indicates the families are keen to give us a chance to sort it out." He has 5 more weeks to solve the case. There is no concrete evidence to say whether the killer travelled in the 7-year-old Range Rover bought by Rolfe 2 weeks earlier or appeared at the scene. Nor is it certain whether he had an accomplice or a getaway car, nor whether he was a professional hitman. But Dibley has a best guess scenario. He knows the 3 men were planning to go for a meal that night with girlfriends to a Basildon restaurant. Kick-off was to be 8 p.m. A telephone call came in the late afternoon. Both Tucker and Tate were still holding their mobile phones when they died. But Dibley believes the call came in from a public telephone the trio used to circumvent itemised bills. It was someone they trusted, summoning them to a meeting. They didn't think they would be long. He has no idea why Workhouse Lane was the meeting place or whether it was familiar to them. Although quiet, it was far from deserted, but there is a pond nearby and often drug smugglers hid stashes underwater. None was armed when discovered, not even Tate, who went almost everywhere with a gun. Dibley believes it unlikely guns were taken from them, so they trusted whoever was behind the killings. The gunman didn't pick up the 8 spent cartridges. It was dark and would have taken too long. He fired off 3 shots quickly, killing Rolfe, then Tucker. They would have known nothing. Tate might have reacted and the first shot to hit him was probably the one through his abdomen. The gunman reloaded twice. Each was hit twice in the head, although probably already dead. Tate took an extra shot. Quote, "The fact that he reloaded twice when his victims were already dead means it was done in an act of vengeance," says Dibley. The motive was Tate. Increasingly out of control, Tucker had tried to give him a place in his drugs hierarchy. That, allied to Tate's behaviour, had infuriated others. Tucker and Rolfe, according to this version, were taken out incidentally, but police in Essex will shortly reopen their investigation into the death of Kevin Whittaker, 28, who died of an apparent overdose in November 1994. He was a drug courier, an associate of Rolfe. His parents and Tate's mother believe he was murdered over a drug debt. His killers, Tucker and Rolfe. Tate's mother, Marie, said her son told her about it when she visited him in hospital after he was shot. Whittaker, whose parents were horrified to discover his link with drugs, disappeared from their home on November 17, 1994. He had brought round his 6-month-old son Lewis, but had gone out when Rolfe called him for the umpteenth time. Almost 30 hours later, police arrived on the Basildon doorstep of Bert and Joan Whittaker to tell them their son had been found, dumped by the roadside. That Whittaker had died from a drug overdose, there was no doubt. Police, seeing needle marks on his right arm, assumed at first he was an addict. They believed his death might be suicide, and other drug users had moved his body, terrified the police might prosecute them for drugs offences. There was an inquest at Chelmsford a year ago. Rolfe called to give evidence, at first denied knowing Whittaker, then admitted he had called him when confronted with itemised phone bills. Quote, "We realised there was more to our son's death," said Joan Whittaker, 64, and then Mrs Tate, after the deaths, claimed Tucker and Rolfe had injected Whittaker in the groin with a paralysing drug often used on horses known as Special K. The victim is powerless but conscious. Whittaker was then injected with lignocaine and died. Mrs Tate thinks Whittaker's friends avenged his death. Her son was the innocent party. But Whittaker was small fry, and although police now believe Rolfe and Tucker murdered him, they feel it had nothing to do with last December's events at Workhouse Lane. Dibley, who remains strangely bullish, has made one arrest. A 27-year-old decorator from South London was held in a joint operation with Scotland Yard and was charged with firearms offences. He is remanded in custody, and he said, quote, "We're not frustrated. You only get frustrated when there's no work to do, and there's plenty to be done. I'm happy with how our inquiry is proceeding, and I'm hopeful of arrest before I retire. It's how I'd want to end a 32-year career." A Billericay man charged with robbery was remanded in custody by Billericay magistrates, but a woman facing the same charge was released on conditional bail. Patrick Tate, 30, and Sarah Saunders, 20, of Selworthy Close, Billericay, are accused of robbery at the Happy Eater restaurant in Leindon on December the 18th. Saunders was released on the conditions that she lived with her parents. Reports to Basildon Police Station daily, does not interfere with any witnesses or visit the Happy Eater, and does not go within 1 mile of Billericay except to visit her solicitor and the court, and that her mother provide a surety of £10,000. Saunders will appear in court again on February the 2nd, and Tate is due to appear on December 29th. The following newspaper article is from the 30th of December 1988 with the headline, "Dangerous Prisoner Escapes Courthouse." This man is on the loose and could be dangerous. If you see him, do not approach him, but report straight to your local police station. He is 30-year-old Patrick Tate, who yesterday made a dramatic escape from the dock of Billericay Court, where he was accused of robbery and possession of cocaine. 3 police officers were injured as bodybuilder Tate of Selworthy Close, Billericay, powered his way out of the court to a waiting motorcycle. 1 WPC received a black eye, and another officer was kicked in the face as police tried to block Tate's escape. But a Basildon police spokesman today said he believed witnesses inside the court tried to impede the police attempts to restrain Tate. Roadblocks, which were imminently set up, failed to trap Tate, and police said they could not give a description of the motorcycle or say whether there was more than one person on the high-powered bike. Tate is 6'2", broad build, between 16 and 18 stone, and had various tattoos. He was wearing a fawn top, a green sweatshirt, and light blue jeans. By October 1995, Mick Steele had 2 successful drug runs under his belt and had earned around £50,000 in smuggling fees alone. It was time to start enjoying the spoils of his life of crime. He had spotted a dilapidated bungalow on the outskirts of Clacton called Meadow Cottage, which was in a prime location but in appalling condition. It needed rewiring, new plumbing, new ceilings, new plastering, the lot. It was perfect. The price was low enough for Steele to get a mortgage based purely on the income from his building business MJS Trading without arousing any suspicion. And once there, Steele could happily spend as much as he wanted, turning it into his dream home. The total price was £80,000. Steele put down £20,000 in cash and took out a loan for the rest. The bungalow was empty. The previous owner had been shipped off to a nursing home, so once contracts were exchanged, he began spending more and more time there, planning the changes he wanted to make and getting quotes from various workmen. Having lost virtually everything just a few years earlier, everything was starting to fall back into place. Michael Steele was back on the rise. Elsewhere in the country, another Essex villain was also celebrating a return to form. Nearly a year after being sent back to prison for smuggling the gun into hospital, Pat Tate was out and lighting up the town with a massive round of wild parties and drug benders. The biggest of the celebrations took place at Tucker's brand new mansion in Fobbing. Going under the name Brine Mount Lodge, the £250,000 luxury hacienda-style bungalow came complete with stunning views of the countryside and stables. In the front garden there was a full-size statue of a naked goddess, and 6-feet-high Greek urns adorned the wall. In the garage block, Tucker kept his Porsche and the brand new Mercedes that he had bought to replace the Jaguar. The property had electronic security gates, a sophisticated video intercom system, and was even patrolled by guard dogs at night. And Tucker had bought the lot for cash. The day of the party started off in the highest of spirits. One of the many pictures taken shows Pat Tate, Mick Steele and Jackie Street all together. Tate has an enormous smile on his face and looks relaxed in an open-neck denim shirt. Steele is standing with his hand on his hip and is also grinning broadly. Between the two huge men, looking like a little ragdoll, is Jackie Street, kicking one of her legs up like a tiller girl. Soon after the picture was taken, Steele took Tate to one side to discuss business. Steele explained that he was planning another drugs run in a couple of weeks' time and wanted to offer Tate the chance to buy into it. Tate asked how much Steele would charge for importing and then balked at the £330 per kilo price, saying it was way too much. It would leave him with little profit from selling the drugs over here. Steele calmly explained that with his way of smuggling, there was virtually no risk. The chances of a customs patrol boat coming across his little rib on the way back from Blankenberg were less than zero. He should know, he'd done it 1,000 times. Sure, it might be cheaper to pay some bozo to pile it in his boot and drive it through customs, but what with the sniffer dogs, x-rays and the like, there was at least a 1 in 10 chance of getting pulled. It would be a false economy. Eventually, the pair agreed on a price of £300 per kilo, and Tate promised to get some money to Steele in the next few days. What Tate had failed to let on, however, was that he didn't actually have any money. Having just got out, he needed most of what he had stashed away to buy himself a car, pay a few bills, and support the flashy lifestyle he was now living. Tucker had given him control of a couple of clubs, but the profits from those would take time to arrive. The sensible thing to do was to pull out of the deal and wait. But Tate wasn't about to start being sensible. In fact, since getting out of prison, he had been getting increasingly out of control and paranoid. He began to fear that he was being left behind by Tucker and Rolfe. The two of them had killed Whittaker in his absence and had set up profitable deals of their own. Tucker, in particular with his house, cars and horses, seemed to be raking it in. Even Rolfe was doing well, having paid £80,000 cash for Tucker's old attached house in Chafford 100. And while Tucker had offered Tate a place in his organisation, Tate knew this was more down to friendship than anything else. Tate wanted to prove himself every bit as good as the others, and the money he could make out of the deal with Steele could be a great start. So rather than wait and miss out, Tate decided to take advantage of the friendships he had made in prison, where he had become great pals with the likes of a well-known cop killer, two brothers from an Essex family known as the Joneses, whose names have been changed, who always had plenty of ready cash knocking about, and Ronnie Knight. The Joneses are the sort of villains whom even hardened members of the criminal underworld go out of their way to avoid. Totally ruthless, fearless and efficient, the fact that few people have heard of them or their dominance of towns like Romford is testament to the power they wield. When Tate approached them, he made an offer they simply wouldn't be able to resist. Basically, if they lent him £40,000 for 2 weeks, he'd give them £50,000 back. Guaranteed. No one wants to look a gift horse in the mouth. The answer had to be yes. Hands were shaken, the money was duly handed over, and that was that. Tate was back in business. The parties continued, and so did the drug binges. Everyone goes a bit crazy when they get out of prison, living life to the fullest and all that. But Tate was taking it to the limit, and then some. It got to the stage where Tate himself was no longer calling the tune. The drugs were. Halfway through his official getting out bash at a snooker hall in Dagenham, a few days after the deal with Steele had been struck, Tate ran out of cocaine. He decided that he needed more, and knowing he had plenty stashed near his home, he asked one of the guests to drive him over to his place. The man had been drinking heavily and knew he was in no fit state to be behind the wheel of a car, so he refused. It was the wrong answer. Tate pulled the man to one side and pulled a gun on him. "Get in your fucking car and drive me back to my fucking house, otherwise I'll kill you." The man reluctantly agreed. Half an hour or so later, mission accomplished. The pair returned to the party. Tate got out of the car and made his way back to the door, before noticing that the man who had just driven him home was following close behind. "Where the fuck do you think you're going?" said Tate. "You ain't coming back in here. Fuck off. Go on, fuck off or I'll shoot you." Sarah Saunders had been Pat Tate's lover for more than 6 years, but during all that time, the couple were only actually together for a year and a half. I saw a side of Pat that nobody else saw. I was really in love with him. He had a terrific personality, but he was always in prison. Sarah had been there when Tate had robbed a happy eater in Basildon. She had been there, along with his then wife, when he jumped the dock at Billericay Magistrates Court to make his bid for freedom. She had been there when he was captured and sentenced to 10 years for robbery and drugs offences. She had even been there when Tate had been shot for the first time. The pair had a son, conceived while Tate was on day release from Hollesley Bay, but despite Tate doting on his child and providing for Sarah whenever he was away, the strain of the separation eventually proved too much. When he got out of prison for the last time, we would just row a lot. He started taking lots more drugs and it was really affecting his personality. He wasn't the same bloke I'd fallen in love with. I hardly recognised him. Sarah had been wanting to leave for some time, but was too scared and felt she had nowhere to go. The situation continued to deteriorate and finally reached rock bottom soon after the Dagenham party. After a furious argument, Tate stormed out and told her that it was all over. She was no longer welcome in his house and had better not be there when he got back. In desperation, Sarah called the boyfriend of a close friend of hers who lived a few streets away. He turned up in his car and helped Sarah grab a few things and took her to stay with them that night. The following morning, there was only one person Sarah wanted to call: Mick Steele. While Tate had been in prison, the person he trusted most with his money was Michael Steele. Tate had put him in charge of around £23,000 and given him strict instructions to dish it out to Sarah as and when it was needed to pay bills or buy things for their child. The pair had got to know each other while Steele was in prison, and she had also become very pally with Jackie Street. As the months went by, so the friendship between Steele and Saunders developed. As soon as he heard the news about her being kicked out, Steele began to help her to set up a new home. Darren Nichols states, "I was trying my hand at running a business repairing and selling fridges and freezers. Mick called me up and asked me how much it would be to replace the fridge in Sarah's new house because the one she had wasn't working. Depending on how much it was, he was going to buy it for her, but he told me not to tell Jackie that he was paying for it, as she wouldn't like it if she thought he was spending their money on someone else. I told him it was best if I come round and have a look at it, because I might be able to get it working. Jackie Street picked me up in her RAV4 and we met Mick and we went over to Sarah's place. It didn't take long to work out what the problem was. The fridge had been plugged into the cooker socket, so every time Sarah turned off the cooker, she turned off the fridge as well. It was around lunchtime, and a couple of friends of Sarah's turned up to cheer her up with some bottles of wine, so we all sat about in the living room chatting about Pat. The whole conversation revolved around just how bad he was, how out of control he'd become, and how much he had changed. It turned out that when Pat found out that her friend's boyfriend was helping Sarah move out, he went completely mad. Even though he had actually told her to leave, he somehow blamed this bloke for splitting the two of them up. Along with Tucker and Rolfe, they went to track the bloke down. They basically kidnapped him off the streets and took him back to Pat's house, when they held a knife to his throat and told him to snort 6 lines of coke. He tried to say no, but they made it pretty obvious that if he didn't do as they said, they would hurt him really bad. So he started snorting, and they made him snort more and more and more, until basically the guy passed out. Once he was unconscious, they stripped all his clothes off and started putting out cigarettes all over his body until he came round. Then they made him snort more coke until he passed out, then they burned him again until he came round again. After a while, Tucker and Rolfe were getting bored and said they thought the bloke had had enough, but Tate wasn't having it. He was like a man possessed. He just kept waking the bloke up and making him snort more and more until eventually they ran out of drugs. Then Tate chucked the bloke in the boot of his car and dumped him in the front garden of his house. When the bloke's girlfriend came home, she found him rolling around naked in the living room, covered in burns and gasping for air. He'd had so much powder up his nostrils that he couldn't breathe through them. He had no idea what was going on or who he was. He was in a right old state, just crying constantly. They'd really broken him. He ended up in a psychiatric unit for 3 days, and when he got out, surprise, surprise, he decided not to press charges. Sarah was upset by the whole thing, but I was surprised to see that Mick was almost in tears himself. He kept saying that he just couldn't believe how someone he had once considered such a good friend had changed so much. He'd get more and more angry every time Sarah mentioned something new that Pat had done to her. He seemed to be taking it really personally. Eventually, he walked over to Sarah and gave her a big hug. It was a whole new side of him.
I'll describe my relationship with Pat as friendly, although we did not socialise outside of work. It was around this time that Pat started talking about a man called Tony Tucker, who he said he had met at a nightclub where Tony was working as a doorman. I had never met Tony, but I can remember Pat talking about him. It was around this time that I was told that Pat had been shot and he was in Basildon Hospital. I went to the hospital with Graham Law to see Pat, and when I was there, Pat's brother Russell turned up. Although I'd known Russell as a car trader, I've had very little to do with him. We only stayed with Pat for around 10 minutes, as I merely wanted to let him know that I had heard and passed on my good wishes. Although I had this regular contact with Pat and we had built up a trust between us, he never told me any details of what he was involved in other than to do with cars. He knew I'd previously been in the Metropolitan Police Service for a short period, and I was also wary of Pat with his volatile temperament. I was always careful of what I asked Pat in case he thought I was trying to get information from him. I was later told that the man I had met at Pat's party, Stephen Ellis, was possibly involved in the shooting, although I do not know whether there is any truth in this. I've never asked Pat about the shooting or his other businesses, as I know he would be suspicious of my reasons. I later became aware that the police had found a number of items in Pat's possession at hospital, and as a result he was returned to prison. I believe the items included a handgun, a quantity of cocaine and some tablets. I did not go and see Pat in prison, but I was asked by Pat through Sarah Saunders to dispose of his current vehicle, which was a black 928 S2 Porsche, index AN0928S. I took possession of the vehicle from Sarah, and after having some work done on it, I put it up for sale on my front for around £8,995. When I had the car, I received a phone call from Pat in prison telling me to keep the money if I sold the car and not give it to Sarah or anyone else. I had the vehicle for a couple of months, and during this time I took 2 deposits on the car, but the sales fell through. When I took the deposits, I used to put a sold sign on the vehicle, and when I did this I received a visit from the man called Tony Tucker. At this time I think I'd met Tucker once or twice when he had attended the car front with Pat before he was returned to prison. When he came to my garage, Tucker told me to give him the money. Although I had heard about Tony Tucker and I did not want to cross him, I was more concerned about crossing Pat, and therefore I told Tony that I would not give him the money. When I stood my ground and I told him what Pat had said, Tony seemed to accept it and left my garage. I kept the car for a couple of months but could not sell it. I therefore returned it to Sarah Saunders. In this time I only saw Tony Tucker once more when he came up to my car front on a horse and asked me if I had any luck selling it. At this time I'd become aware of Tony moving into a house in Fobbing High Road with a large plot of land. I had a couple of phone calls from Pat whilst he was in prison, but they appeared to be merely for a chat rather than anything specific. The next time I saw Pat was when he came down to my car front after he'd been released from prison. This would have been at the end of October 95, beginning of November 95. I believe at this time he was on his own and we had a general chat about domestic and general matters. At this time he appeared quite level-headed and normal. My next contact with Pat and Tony Tucker was when they came to my garage after Pat had had an accident in Tony's black Porsche. The vehicle was badly damaged and Pat was asking me to sort it out as cheaply as possible. The vehicle was brought to the One Tree Hill site and my daughter spent a lot of time trying to locate cheap second-hand spares for the repair. I also arranged for quotes to carry out the bodywork. As a result of the Porsche repairs, I began to have virtual day-to-day contact with either Pat, Tony or both. The majority of the time they were together and were accompanied by a younger man called Craig. At that time I had a blue Range Rover 3.5 Vogue SE index F424NPE on my forecourt, as I'd recently taken that in as part exchange. I had purchased this vehicle from a Mr. Graham Herson of Kingston Road, Stanford-le-Hope, on the 2nd of the 11th, 95. I can produce a copy of the purchase invoice for this transaction as my exhibit BTD/1. As Tony Tucker was now without a vehicle, he and Pat showed interest in purchasing the Range Rover which I had for sale at £10,995. After some negotiation, I agreed to sell it to them for £9,800, but I knew that neither Pat or Tony would be able to get finance on the vehicle. When I pointed this out, Tony stated that his friend would be buying it on his behalf, but he would be using it. I agreed to accept a £2,000 deposit and put the remainder on finance. A friend of Tony's, a man who gave his name as Mr. P. Cuthbert of Templewood Road, Hadley, Essex, then attended my site and provided sufficient details for me to complete the finance agreement. I was handed £2,000 in cash, and at this time I'm unable to say which one of them gave it to me. They then took the keys from me and drove the vehicle away from my forecourt. I completed a sales invoice for the transaction and showed the purchaser as Tony Tucker. I can produce a copy of this invoice as my exhibit BTD/2. I then sent off the completed finance agreement and received my cheque from the company for the balance. I am still in possession of the registration document for the vehicle, which I can produce as exhibit BTD/3. The finance company would have issued a pay-in book to Mr. P. Cuthbert to enable the monthly payments to be made. This book would have been sent to Cuthbert's home address. The Range Rover was taken by Pat and Tony on the 14th of the 11th, 95. From that day when Pat, Tony and Craig visited my car front, they would be using the Range Rover. Craig would normally be the driver with Pat in the front passenger seat and Tony in the back. As stated, I had a number of visits from them inquiring about the progress with the Porsche repairs. I can remember during one of their visits, Tony was really annoyed and stated that they were trying to link him to the supply of the ecstasy tablet which killed the girl called Leah Betts. He stated that he knew who had supplied it as he'd been told by one of the doormen. He also stated that he had made some checks and he knew that the girl regularly took tablets and that she didn't even live with her father. He was really ranting and raving to Pat about it, and I heard him say that it was only because her dad was a policeman that such a fuss was being made. During the morning of Wednesday the 6th of the 12th, 95, I was at the car front when Pat, Tony, Craig and Mr. P. Cuthbert arrived in the Range Rover. I would describe Cuthbert as a male, white, 5'10" to 5'11", late 30s, reasonably fit build. I've been told that he is a ceiling fixer. The four of them came into the office and I was handed by one of them the paying-in book relating to the Range Rover finance, and between them they produced £321 and 40p in cash. I was asked by one of them, I can't remember who, to keep the book and remind them when the payments were due. I agreed to do this as it was in my interest to make sure the finance was paid. I'd also been told by Pat and Tony at the time of purchasing the vehicle that they intended to pay it off in one lump sum fairly quickly. I paid this sum into the Barclays Bank at Pitsea Broadway the following day. Sometime during an earlier meet with Pat, he had asked me whether I had a suitable vehicle for him to give to Sarah Saunders. He told me there had been a lot of problems between them and he wanted to give her a car to get her off his back. I told him I had a VW Passat on the forecourt which I had taken in as part exchange on the 25th of the 11th, 95. I showed him the vehicle, which was metallic green in colour and had a registration number F120GGF. He agreed to take it for a test drive and later we agreed on a price of £1,800 for the vehicle. I can produce a purchase invoice for this VW Passat as my exhibit BTD/5. I left my garage forecourt around 1700 to 1730 on Wednesday the 6th of December 1995, intending to play my friend Keith Moore at squash. At this time my daughter and an employee, Mickey Stenning, were at the car front. En route to squash I received a phone call from Mickey Stenning stating that Herc, which is my pet name for Pat Tate due to his size, had arrived at the car front to collect the VW Passat. Pat then came onto the phone and told me that he would still take the vehicle even though he didn't need it as he had a bust-up with Sarah Saunders. I told him he didn't have to take it, but he insisted that he would. He told me that he would pay for the vehicle in the morning as he had a lump of money coming. As a result, I agreed to Pat taking the vehicle that night, which he did. The following morning, Thursday the 7th of December 95, I returned to my car site at around 9 AM. between 11 and 12 midday, I was at the site talking to a customer when a female approached me and called me by name. I did not recognise her, and as I was talking, she appeared to move away. A short while later, I returned to my office and the same woman approached me and said words to the effect of, "Bow, can they trace the Range Rover back to you?" Not knowing her, I said, "What Range Rover?" And she replied, "The one that Tony's been using." At that, I realised that she was referring to the Range Rover being used by Pat Tate and Tony Tucker. I asked her why, and she just replied, "Oh, nothing." She then walked out of the office. I would describe this woman as female, white, 5'3", slim build, tanned freckled face with mousy straight hair. I believe that she is the girlfriend of Tony Tucker. I was obviously concerned about why she had come in and asked that question, so I immediately tried to contact Pat Tate on his mobile telephone. When I called the number 0585429316, I got no reply, so I tried his other mobile number. When this was answered, it was by a female who I did not recognise. I asked to speak to the big man, and she said he was out on a job. I asked if everything was alright, and she just said yeah. I then tried to phone Tony on his mobile, but all I got was Tony's answer phone. I did not leave a message. I then tried to phone Tony's home phone, but that was unobtainable. I've not seen Tony Tucker, Pat Tate, Craig or Mr. Cuthbert since. Purely as background information, I'm aware that Pat, Tony and Craig were heavily into bodybuilding and in their quest to increase their size were injecting substances. I believe that all three of them used a Progress gym for an hour each morning. Okay, so obviously a very detailed statement there. Now, I think Barry's always come across incredibly well in the documentaries that I've seen. I've never spoken to the guy personally, but when I listen to parts of the documentary, especially the Truth documentary, he always comes across incredibly well. He's obviously someone that knew Pat Tate for a lot of years, and this statement is incredibly interesting, particularly the part where Pat is in prison. He calls up Barry and says, "Look, if you sell this Porsche, please keep the money. I don't want it going to Sarah. I don't want it to go into anybody. I need you to keep hold of this money until I get out." Now, at some stage, this Porsche has had a deposit put down on it. Tucker has obviously driven past and seen the sold sign on this Porsche and gone in to see Barry to collect the money. Now, this all ties in with a level of mistrust here between Tucker and Tate. The more I read these statements, the more I read into this, the more I can see that the cracks are appearing. Tate has obviously felt concerned, or maybe it's just simply paranoia, but he's calling up his good friend there to say, "Look, don't let anybody touch this money. No one, not Tony, not Craig, not Sarah, not anybody." And what's Tony done? He's seen that that car's sold, and the first thing that he's done is rock up at the car front and demanded the money off of Barry. It does make you wonder exactly what their relationship was like towards the end of their lives. Also remember that shortly after this period, or around this period I should say, Tony Tucker turns up with this massive house in Fobbing. Okay, so let's just stop very briefly and just clarify what we've got here, because this is not an isolated incident. Now, Pat Tate is recalled to prison after being in hospital and being found with the handgun in his bedclothes. He's returned to prison, and during his spell in prison, he gives full financial control of his finances over to Tony Tucker. It's during this time period that it's Tony Tucker's responsibility to pay Sarah Saunders a set amount of money each month. Now, sometime during that spell in prison, Pat Tate has a change of heart. He contacts Michael Steele and says to Michael Steele, "Look, I'm not happy about Tony Tucker dealing with my finances. I'm not happy with what he's spending the money on. Can you take full financial control from him? And I want you, Michael Steele, to pay Sarah Saunders a certain amount of money each month." Now, this version of events came from Michael Steele, but it was also fully backed up in Sarah Saunders' police interview. It's also backed up in terms of this statement here. The fact that Tate was in prison, he said, "Look, I want you to keep all the money for when I get out. I don't want you to give it to anybody." And then Tony's come along and tried to take that money from Barry Dorman. What we also had was a statement from Donna Garwood's brother, Donna Garwood being the then girlfriend of Tony Tucker. Her brother said in his statement that actually Tony had said to her that he was concerned about something that Pat had done, which reflected badly on him. He was quite paranoid, he was staying in more, he was quite jumpy. And these three statements from three separate individuals are telling a very similar story. There's a level here of distrust between Tate and Tucker in November, December 1995. Now, what is important to cover in this video is also Tate's real demeanour on December the 6th. It's quite interesting when we look at the early parts of December the 6th when Tucker, Tate, Rolfe and Cuthbert approached the car front to pay off the finance agreement. It's almost like the three of them are scrambling around to come up with £300. Yet later on in the evening when Tate is talking to Dorman about buying this VW, he's almost quite carefree. He says to Dorman, look, I don't need the car anymore. I've fallen out with Sarah again, but don't worry, I'm still going to buy it. I'm coming into a load of money. I'll be back in the morning to pay it off. The mention of coming into money is also spoken about by Barry Dorman in this following passage, where he states the following. I'd also been told by Pat and Tony at the time of purchasing the Range Rover that they intended to pay it off in one lump sum fairly quickly. Now, in my opinion, December the 6th is the day of the deal. It's the day that Tate thinks he's going to come into some money. Now, what doesn't make any sense is the fact that the call at 2:30 p.m. to Tucker's mobile is supposedly the one where they say, look, there's been a delay, there's snow on the ground, but we're going to take a look at where the plane's going to land in the future. Tate, in my mind, believes he's coming into money on December the 6th. This isn't a dry run. This isn't somewhere they're going to look at something that's going to be happening in a week's time. Tate is telling Dorman in this very statement he'll be back tomorrow with £2,000 to pay off this car that he doesn't even need. In my opinion, Tate feels like he's coming into hundreds of thousands of pounds, not maybe 10 or 20 grand, but hundreds of thousands. Now put yourself in Tate's position for one moment. If you'd had that phone call, you'd heard from Tucker at 2:30 p.m. that there'd been a delay, that there was snow on the ground, they wouldn't be receiving the money as quickly as they thought they would, that a deal had been put off for a few days. Would you really be speaking to someone at 5:30, having been armed with that information, and then be telling them, look, don't worry, I'm coming into a lump of cash, I'll be back in the morning to pay off the £2,000. I don't need the car, fallen out with Sarah again, but I'm still going to take it off you, I've messed you about, I'll give you £2,000, it's not a problem. Would you really be doing that? In my mind, as I've just said, Tate was convinced that he was coming into money on December the 6th. Now just to go over again what is said in that statement here, it states the following. En route to Squash, I received a phone call from Mickey Stenning stating that Herc, which was my pet name for Pat Tate due to his size, had arrived at the car front to collect the VW Passat. Pat then came onto the phone and told me that he would still take the vehicle even though he didn't need it, as he'd had a bust-up with Sarah Saunders. I told him that he didn't need to take it, but he insisted that he would. He told me that he would pay for the vehicle in the morning as he had a lump of money coming. As a result, I agreed to Pat taking the vehicle that night, which he did. It just doesn't make any sense. The whole notion of this murder, the fact that Steele is showing them where this lane is, he's going to show them where this plane's going to land. These people think they're coming into money this night. I'm sure of it. That's why they've got this meal booked. Why would you be having the meal for a pre-celebration for money you haven't even received yet? The absolute notion of that is just ridiculous. In my opinion, they thought they were going to have the deal that night. There was some sort of deal going to take place, and they thought they were going to hit the big time on December the 6th. Now, when you take a look at this from a different angle, it also ties in with Darren Nichols' original version of events for Mickey Steele going to meet Pat Tate for a deal. Now, what doesn't make any sense is why these three individuals, as in Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, why these three individuals would travel down that lane unarmed. Now, obviously, we have no way of telling for certain if they were armed or not, but it's more than likely the case that they weren't. So why would they be down that lane? We know there's a gun range there. Could they have been lured down there on the pretense of buying weaponry for a later armed robbery that was going to take place after the meal? I don't know. But one thing is for certain is that I'm getting the impression here that Tate was convinced, absolutely convinced, that he was coming into a great sum of money on December the 6th. Now from here we move on to the murders themselves. It was at 18:44 where Sarah Saunders calls Pat Tate, and they have a phone call which lasts almost 4 minutes in duration. Now this isn't the impression we get when we take a look at Sarah Saunders' police statement, where she claims that the telephone call was actually very brief, that she just spoke to Pat and he said, I can't really speak at the moment, I'm with some people, but he seemed quite relaxed, quite upbeat, quite jovial, and he said he would get in contact with Sarah Saunders the following day. Now, what Sarah herself found quite strange about that phone call is that if he was with Michael Steele, she can't understand why Pat wouldn't have simply said, I'm with Mickey and the boys at the moment, I'll call you back tomorrow. Because that wasn't what Pat Tate actually said. His words were to the effect of, I can't talk at the moment, I'm with some people, everything's fine, I'll give you a call back tomorrow and we'll sort it out. Anyway, What is most important about this telephone call, other than the content of the call itself, is the fact that the official narrative, the official version of events for these murders as put forward by the prosecution, was that the Range Rover entered the lane shortly before 7 p.m. It travelled down the cold, dark, lonely farm track. It reached the 5-bar locked gate. Craig Rolfe pulled up to the gate and the rear passenger said, "Just wait there, I'm going to open the gate." He got out the back and then Jack Womes appeared from nearby bushes and executed the 3 men. Now this is where things start to get a little bit more confusing. As in Darren Nichols' official testimony, he claims that he has a conversation with Michael Steele after these murders, where Michael Steele tells him that they are travelling down the lane in question when Pat Tate's phone springs to life. His phone starts to ring and it's Sarah Saunders at the other end of the call. Steele remarks at being rather paranoid and concerned that Tate's going to mention that he's with Steele in the vehicle, but luckily he doesn't. He remarks to Darren that it was lucky that he didn't stay on with Mickey at the moment because he didn't know how he had stopped Jack Womes from executing the 3 men. Now we know that this can't be true because the call lasts almost 4 minutes in duration. So the actual distance from the start of the lane to the lock gate is no more than a 10 or 15 second drive. So clearly what has happened here is that either this call originated way before they got to the lane in question, or they were waiting down the lane for a few minutes before being executed. Now what is quite annoying is that we have a very rudimentary mistake by the investigating officer interviewing Sarah Saunders, as he fails to ask her if she believed that the vehicle was moving at the time of the phone call. He didn't say to Sarah, did it sound like they were moving? Did they sound like they were in a car? Did he sound like he was with other people? Could you hear noise in the background? None of these questions were put to Sarah Saunders. So we have no idea if the Range Rover was in transit at this time or stationary. Now to conclude this video, I'm going to leave you with a statement which you may not have heard before. This is from a lady by the name of Susan Carey, who was the mother of one of Pat Tate's girlfriends. She was one of the last people to speak to Pat Tate before his murder. The following statement is from Susan Carey, dated the 6th of February 1996. I live with my family in the Eastwood area. I have 4 daughters, the youngest of whom is Claire. Claire is 23 years old. On and off, Claire lives at home but spends time with her boyfriend. At present, Claire works at TGI Fridays at the Lakeside Complex in West Thurrock. However, she had previously worked in Southend at a restaurant called Sellers, and I believe that Kim Webber was the owner. It was through Claire's association with the restaurant and Kim that she became acquainted with Pat Tate. My first impression of Pat was only from what Claire had told me, and I first became aware of Claire actually seeing Pat when he was in hospital having been shot in the arm. I'd only ever met Pat once when he came to the door at my house calling for Claire. I was aware that Pat also served some time in prison and that he would keep in contact with Claire when he got out. It was only a couple of months ago when he must have been released because I started getting phone calls from Pat. He would be very polite and ask for Claire, and more often than not she wasn't in. So he would apologise for troubling me and ask that I leave a message for Claire to contact him. I approached Claire and at one stage voiced my concern because I didn't really want my daughter getting involved with him because of his past. Claire assured me that she wasn't. The last time I had any contact with Pat Tate was on Wednesday the 6th of December 1995 when he phoned me at home at around 6 p.m. He had rung several times earlier in the day asking for Claire, and on the final occasion, Claire still wasn't back from work. It was then that Pat said that he had to go out for around half an hour, but asked that I tell Claire to hang on as he would be back. Pat didn't sound concerned or worried on the phone. The only other contact I had was later that evening from Claire herself, saying that she'd been waiting outside Pat's for ages and he hadn't turned up, so she was going to go back to her boyfriend's. When Pat last rang, he sounded like he was at home because he said, "Please tell her to hold on." He explained that he was thinking about leaving a note on his door for Claire, but didn't know whether he would bother. Whenever Pat rang up, he would always introduce himself as Pat Tate. I had no doubts that it was not him. One of the more common questions that I've been asked over the past couple of years surrounding the Essex Boys murders seems to focus on the drugs which were found in Pat Tate's bloodstream. Some people believe he was overdosed intentionally, and others just believe that they were heavy drug users. In this video, we're going to take a look at some of the evidence which could support either claim. And first, we're going to start with a newspaper article from The Guardian, which was dated the 7th of the 3rd, 96, with the title The Hit, which describes what was found in Pat Tate's bloodstream. It's in this newspaper article that it states the following. They died in under 2 seconds, and only one, Tate, seemed to know anything about it. How much, as almost everything in this case, is conjecture. A post-mortem examination highlighted a combination in his bloodstream of heroin, cocaine, cannabis and steroids. Now, when I first posed that question to myself, I guess I just thought it was a little bit outlandish. You know, these 3 guys were heavy drug users in any case, taking pretty much whatever they could get their hands on. So is it really that strange that Tate was found with that combination of drugs in his bloodstream? But then when you tie it into certain other events, such as the potential unrest between Tucker and Tate leading up to the murders, and the fact that Tucker and Rolfe had killed Kevin Whittaker just a year earlier via a similar method, it did make me wonder if there was something more to this. Now, many of you watching this video will have seen the films, the Rise of the Foot Soldier films, etc., where Tucker and Tate are portrayed almost as brothers. But when we take a look at the official statements surrounding this case, it appears that shortly before the murders, there was a lot more going on than what is actually portrayed in these films. Just to give you a brief overview of some of the things that I've discussed in previous videos, we had the situation with Tate being recalled to prison after the shooting incident. We had Tucker going round to Tate's friend to try and collect the money on a car that Tate was selling whilst he was in prison. We had Tucker's purchasing of this brand new house, Tate being concerned where he got the money for this house from. We had, at one point in time, Tucker dealing with Tate's then long-term girlfriend, Sarah Saunders, and paying her a salary every month whilst Tate was in prison. And Tate seemingly had a change of heart whilst in prison and took that responsibility from Tony Tucker and gave it to Michael Steele. So there was certainly a level of distrust there between Tucker and Tate, particularly near the end. We also have the following statement, which is from Donna Garwood's brother. Now, Donna Garwood was the then girlfriend of Tony Tucker, and her brother mentions the following in his statement. I remember Donna told me once that Pat Tate had come out of prison. She said, he's only been out 5 weeks. She said that since Pat had come out, Tony had become worried about something. He had taken a bit of a low profile. He wasn't himself. Donna said he started staying in with her a lot, and Tony was a bit jumpy. Donna said she thought Pat had done something which reflected on Tony, but she didn't say what. Now, obviously that statement is quite vague in places, and it does leave a lot to the imagination. But one thing that is for sure is that when you combine that one with Barry Dorman's statements, the car dealer who was Pat Tate's friend, where he talks about Tucker turning up on the forecourt and demanding the money for the car, which was sold on Tate's behalf, and Tate calling Barry Dorman from prison and saying, under no circumstances give the money to anybody else. Make sure you keep it until I come out. Don't give it to Tony. Don't give it to anybody. And yet Tucker was turning up there to try and get hold of that money. There's something not quite right there between that relationship with Tucker and Tate leading up to their murders. Let's take a look back at Barry Dorman's statement from the 8th of December 1995, where it states the following. I did not go and see Pat in prison, but I was asked by Pat through Sarah Saunders to dispose of his current vehicle, which was a black 928 S2 Porsche. I took possession of the vehicle from Sarah, and after having some work done on it, I put it up for sale on my front for around £8,995. When I had the car, I received a phone call from Pat in prison telling me to keep the money if I sold the car and not to give it to Sarah or anyone else. I had the vehicle for a couple of months, and during this time I took 2 deposits on the car, but the sales fell through. When I took the deposits, I used to put a sold sign on the vehicle, and when I did this, I received a visit from the man called Tony Tucker. At this time, I think I'd met Tucker once or twice when he had attended the car front with Pat before he was returned to prison. When he came to my garage, Tucker told me to give him the money, whilst Pat was in prison. Although I had heard about Tony Tucker and I did not want to cross him, I was more concerned about crossing Pat, and therefore I told Tony I would not give him the money. When I stood my ground, I told him what Pat had said. Tony seemed to accept it and left my garage. I kept the car for a couple of months, but could not sell it. I therefore returned it to Sarah Saunders. In this time, I only saw Tony Tucker once more, when he came up to my car front on a horse and asked me if I had any luck selling it. At this time, I'd become aware of Tony moving into a house in Fobbing High Road with a large plot of land. I had a couple of phone calls from Pat whilst he was in prison, but they appeared to be merely for a chat rather than anything specific. The next time I saw Pat was when he came down to my car front after he had been released from prison. And then, as I touched upon earlier, we had the situation with Sarah Saunders whilst Pat was in prison. Now, she was being paid X amount of money to keep her going whilst Pat was inside. Originally, that job was given to Tony Tucker. It was his responsibility. But somewhere down the line, Michael Steele, I believe, got called to the prison for a meeting with Pat, or a conversation with Pat, where he said that he no longer trusted Tony, didn't know what he was doing with the money. He wasn't quite sure where the money was going and whether Sarah was getting it or something along those lines. So he decided to give that responsibility to Michael Steele. So regardless, there was a level there of distrust between Tucker and Tate. And when we go back to that statement from Donna Garwood's brother, what exactly does he mean there, or did she mean, when she said that Tucker was concerned that Tate had done something which reflected on him? What exactly is being spoken about there? Now, throughout my time making videos on the Essex Boys case, I've heard a lot of rumours. I've had people coming forward saying they know things, etc, etc. And one of the ones that sticks in my mind is the fact that Tate was supposedly going to be drugged up and given over to someone else. Now, does that tie in with the sightings of the white vehicle that was seen following the Range Rover, or the Range Rover following that white vehicle, turning into White House Farm just before they were supposedly killed? Does that tie in somewhere with that white vehicle, that Tate was somehow rendered unconscious and he was going to be given over to someone else? Was that part of the plan? We know that Tucker and Rolfe had done something similar before with Kevin Whittaker. But I guess the biggest sort of red flag for me personally, that this could have some sort of, I don't know, credibility, is the fact of these phone calls. And this is something I've touched upon in previous videos. I can't get my head around the fact that it's Tony Tucker who is speaking to this, whoever it was, at the Sorrel Horse Inn. Now, we're always told that it was Tate that was, you know, the catalyst. Tate was the person who was the marked man in all of this. He was the catalyst for these murders. So why was it Tucker that was receiving the call to supposedly arrange the meet for that evening? Now, some people will say that Tate was with Tucker on Timberlog Lane at that payphone when the meeting was arranged. But there's something that I'd missed, even after looking into this case for the last couple of years, something that I've overlooked, which was just staring me in the face the whole time, to be perfectly honest. When we take a look at the phone records, there is something which gives a great deal of credibility to the fact that Tucker and Tate were most definitely in two separate places when the meeting was arranged. If we take a look at the phone log here, 1423, Tate's landline, Tate's home address to Tucker's mobile. 1423. Then at 1429, the payphone at the Sorrel Horse Inn calls Tucker's mobile. Now, this is the call which is supposedly to arrange the meet for later that evening, the one which they are later killed. Then we have 1432, again the payphone at the Sorrel Horse Inn to the payphone on Timberlog Lane. So at 1423, Tate is most likely at his home address, phoning Tucker's mobile. Then that payphone at the Sorrel Horse Inn contacts Tucker's mobile, and then the telephone on Timberlog Lane. Now, we know that Tucker was on Timberlog Lane because he was settling up a bill at a carpet shop on that very same road. So if Tate was the catalyst, then why is Tucker doing all of the arranging? Why is he the person that is arranging the meet for later that evening? Why are they trying to contact Tony Tucker? Is this because Tucker and Rolfe were going to hand Tate over to somebody else? Was this a double cross which went horribly wrong? I think, to summarise, without seeing a full toxicology report and looking at the levels of the drugs found in Tate's system, it's quite difficult to make any real sort of assumption as to whether he was intentionally overdosed or whether this was simply three individuals who like to take every drug under the sun. Could this have been a double cross which went wrong, as I just said earlier? Was it Tucker's job to get Tate down the lane for someone else to be collected? Or was this simply just three people who like to dabble in whatever drug they could find? Many thanks for joining me for this video. Very shortly you'll be able to see some other videos from the channel, including the Essex Boys playlist, which has all of the videos concerning this case in one convenient folder. If you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. I look forward to seeing you all again in the next video. Take care. Cheers.